command mark, the time will be running at X minus 20 seconds. Mark. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
Spawned by the continuing decline and fall of society as we know it, and created on the second-floor spare-bedroom studio in the Piedmont of South Carolina. Podcasting on a shoestring budget and changing the world one freak at a time. It's the B-Movie Cast with your host, Vince Rotolo.
From coast to coast and worldwide via the internet, this is the B-Movie Cast, the podcast of unusual film and television.
The following is a paid advertisement. Really? A paid advertisement? Wait, the B-Movie Cast got paid? Yes, the following is a paid advertisement. This episode of the B-Movie Cast is brought to you by the estate planning services of Twyla Minear Brooks, attorney at law. Remember, when the zombie apocalypse comes, things will move pretty fast.
The body should be disposed of at once, preferably by cremation.
Well, how long after death, then, does the body become reactivated?
It's only a matter of minutes.
Minutes? Well, that doesn't give people time to make any arrangements.
Oh, you're right. It doesn't give them time to make funeral arrangements. The bodies must be carried to the street and burned. They must be burned immediately. Soak them with gasoline and burn them. The bereaved will have to forego the dubious comforts that a funeral service will give. They're just dead flesh and dangerous.
So don't leave your estate planning needs until the last minute, because you don't know when that last minute could come. Call Twyla Minear Brooks, attorney at law, at 859-351-2294. That's 859-351-2294. Remember, when you go, you don't want people saying,
"Yeah, they're dead. They're all messed up."
Twyla Minear Brooks, attorney at law, is licensed for practice in the state of Kentucky. Consult your local attorney for matters outside of the state of Kentucky.
Hi, and welcome to this very, very special episode of the B-Movie Cast. Before I go any farther, I want to get our contact information out of the way. We love hearing from all of you, so we have a feedback segment devoted to your comments and suggestions, and this is how you can contact us. Option 1, pick up your phone and dial 888-936-0808. This is a toll-free number and a very easy way to leave a voice message. Option 2, you can make your own MP3 file and send it in to bmoviecast@gmail.com. Or use your smartphone voice software and record a call, then just send that in as an attachment instead. Or option 3, if you're not into talking, you can just shoot us an email to bmoviecast@gmail.com. Our website is bmoviecast.com, where you can subscribe to the podcast. It's free, and there you can join us on the Facebook B-Moviecast fan page and letterbox. Also, you can play the contest by sending in your answer by email to bmoviecast@gmail.com with contest in the subject line. And check out the links while you're there, or buy a t-shirt. I currently have smalls to 4X's. If you want to help us financially, there's a donation box you can click on as a supporter on the Lugosi, Karloff, Agar, and the infamous Xanadu level through PayPal. Also, the easiest way to donate is to click on the Amazon bar on the right side of our homepage. This Amazon link will take you to Amazon.com to make your purchase. It doesn't cost you anything, and you can still log into your personal accounts when you get there. It's completely private, so think about us before you buy online. We have our co-host from Lexington, Kentucky, author, editor, screenwriter, film producer, Nick Brown. He has a new website, and it is authornickbrown.com. That's AUTHORNICBROWN.com. He's the author of the Werewolf for Hire series starting with Blood Curse. He's also selling a series of books in collaboration with his wife, Fiona Young Brown, called the B-Movie Cookbooks. All of these are available on Amazon. He has produced 3 movies. The first 2 are Wretch and Loss Prevention, both of which could be ordered on Blu-ray or DVD through Amazon. And he is also the producer of the award-winning film Fall of Usher. which is now available for purchase or rental on iTunes and Amazon Streaming. Joining us today is a fan favorite, the extraordinary photographer and our good friend from London, Mark Mawston. His website is markmawston.com. That's MarkMawston. You can also buy his work on rockarchive.com, the world's finest print archive specializing in rock and roll imagery, featuring some of the most famous rock photographers on the planet. Mark's photographs have been featured in many of the leading titles in the music press, such as Mojo, OMM, and Music Collector. His work can also be seen in books such as I Was There, 50 Gigs That Changed the World, as well as most of the leading nationals, such as The Times, The Guardian, The Telegraph, and The Independent. Also joining us today is the incredible Steve Vertlieb, the man who saved the movies. He is an award-winning writer, film historian, critic, archivist, poet. He's done it all. He's talked to everybody. He's been everywhere. I'm in awe, Steve. Thank you for doing all you've done.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, but I have to tell you, in my own estimation, I'm just a fan. I have been a movie fan since I was 4 years old, and that was around 1950, and I've seen probably zillions of movies. The greatest joy of my life is that I got to know and meet, and in many cases, befriend most of my lifelong heroes. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm just a movie fan, and I've just been very lucky in contacting many of the people I've grown up adoring.
I've read some of your stories about your contacts, especially when you were younger with your brother, and they are so hilarious. I love them. I wish I had the nerve to walk up to people like that and just start talking and get it. Well, in your case, you always get introduced to everybody and you get invited to go behind the scenes, and it's just amazing.
Well, I'm kind of like Deborah Carr in The King and I. Whenever I feel afraid, I hum a happy tune.
Ah, okay.
So, Steve, I do have to ask, because you said you've been a fan of film since you were 4 years old.
Yes.
So what was that first film that you remember that started you out as a fan?
Oh, my gosh. Well, my dad, I've told the story before. My dad brought home our first console television in 1950. It was a small 19-inch RCA television. And I can remember, if you recall, or if you're old enough to recall,
yes,
in the early days of television, nothing came on until the late afternoon or early evening. And there was a test pattern on all day long. And I would sit transfixed on the floor next to the TV watching that silly Indian head nickel, waiting for the television to come alive. And I think probably my first experience of film might have been old westerns from the 1930s. There was a gentleman named Pete Boyle, who was a beloved children's host here in Philadelphia. His son became an actor, Peter Boyle, who of course played young Frankenstein. But his dad was a lovely white-haired man who would draw cartoons for the children every night. He was known as Uncle Pete. And he would run old Hopalong Cassidy films and Colonel Tim McCoy and Buck Jones. And I think that's probably my first experience. As far as science fiction, I can remember watching The Lost Continent with Cesar Romero and Unknown World, both of which are dreadful films. But at the time, as a wide-eyed 4-year-old or 6-year-old, I was transfixed, and I never got over it. I've been glued to the movie screen or television screen virtually every day of my life since then. And I'm 76 years old now, so that's a considerable amount of time wasted in front of the screen.
It's interesting, Steve, because Steve and I did a very in-depth interview, which is going to be in the next edition of We Belong Dead, and we're both very excited to see that because obviously it's a good magazine. But you said there about the small screen, but it was the large screen that had the big impact. And we're not going to repeat too much from that interview, Steve, because you are such an interesting man. There is so much to talk about rather than what we've already covered, which was a lot. And I recommend that any fan of fandom goes out there and grabs a copy of this when it's out, which I believe is next month. But you started, believe it or not, orderly, because you actually were standing outside your local cinema and heard just the noises. And I believe it was a Ray Harryhausen film, wasn't it?
It was.
The EMR that you heard, and that sent you off, into the fanboy you are.
Well, I can remember watching an episode of Lights Out, the Arch Obler television series, maybe 1952, 53. And they had a frightening scene on, and I started screaming, apparently. And my mother rushed to the TV and shut it off and said, "That's it. No more horror for you." Of course, being a rebel, even at that age, I thought, that's what you think. I never let her forget that, by the way. But my little friends used to go to the movie theater, the Benner Theater around the corner, and they would tell me about the films they had seen. And I remember hearing stories about a film about giant ants called Them, and Vincent Price wearing a makeup that fell apart when Phyllis Kirk pounded his face in the House of Wax. And I was so enthralled by those that I started a journal. And whenever I heard those stories, or whenever I could go and see a film by myself at the Saturday matinee, I'd write down the whole story. And I guess that was the beginning of my writing when I was 6 or 7 years old. But Mark, getting back to your story, in 1957, all of my friends went to the Benner to see 20 Million Miles to Earth, and my mom would not allow me to see it. And so I went to the back of the Benner Theater, and I leaned my ear against the back doors of the theater, and I could hear the roar of the Emir, and my imagination went wild, trying to conjure up imagery of what was going on screen.
Aww. So your parents were very protective of you?
My mom was. She used to take me to see MGM musicals. My dad would take me to see Clark Gable movies like Soldier of Fortune, or Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth, or Ford's The Searchers. My mom would take me to see The Bandwagon with Fred Astaire, High Society with Crosby and Sinatra. So I grew up on Westerns and musicals, but in my heart of hearts, although I love all motion pictures, I'm just a movie fanatic, always have been. I guess my preference, or my major influence, has been fantasy, sci-fi, horror. And I'll tell you a quick story, and we probably talked about this in the interview, Mark.
It doesn't matter, Stephen. There's nothing. You don't need to say a quick story. You can be as long as you like today, because this is the first time in B-Moviecast history that someone is allowed to talk more than I am. Because I normally hog it, let's be honest. But no, today, this is about you. And all my friends will be amazed that I'm quiet for this long, but I, like everybody else, like you, I'm a fanboy, but I'm a fan of you, Steve, because what you've done is so important. It's so important. You have preserved history and the importance of this genre. And although now it's starting to get the kind of recognition it deserves, back in the day, it was, frowned upon. And these were called B movies, which is why this cast exists, because, people thought they were a support or something. They weren't as important. Now, culturally, they address things that you could never do in a mainstream film now. So that's why they're important. So when you say a short story, go back to it and be as long as you like.
Well, I confess that there are many, many other historians out there who know a great deal more than I do. They're also younger than I am. But when I won the Rondo Life Achievement Award in 2016, I think, in Louisville, Kentucky, David Colton, who was the former editor-in-chief of USA Today, and he runs the Classic Horror Film Board, and he put together the Rondo Awards. And he noted that I was one of the original, or the earliest, film historians. Maybe historian is not the right word, but I started writing about my love of movies in magazines back around 1968, 1969. The first being L'Incroyable Cinema, which was a fanzine in Manchester, England, and put together by a gentleman who's no longer with us by the name of Harry Nadler. And Harry was involved in British fandom for many, many years. And L'Incroyable Cinema is something of a revered publication now, but I was one of the original writers for that. And I think the first piece I ever wrote for him was a mini review of Kubrick's 2001. But getting back to Forbidden Planet, 1956, my brother and I used to eat oatmeal, among other things, in the morning for breakfast. And my mom always bought us Mother's Oats. Well, somewhere around 1955, Mother's Oats was tied in with MGM and the promotion of this new spectacular science fiction film called Forbidden Planet. And on every label, on every box of Mother's Oats oatmeal, there were posters of this coming science fiction masterpiece. So you've got to remember that my imagination had gone wild. So had my brothers. And we were waiting a year for Forbidden Planet to come to the theater. Now, long story short, I had a great aunt who was, how can I say this, a prude, very old-fashioned. She was very prim and proper, very full of herself, very old-fashioned, didn't like anyone or anything, and quite honestly, I couldn't stand her. When she spoke, she was a bigot. She was not a nice lady. With all due respect, may she rest in peace. But when I had to spend time with her, hours would seem like weeks. So again, long story short, it's 1956. Forbidden Planet opens at the Benner Theater, right around the corner from where we lived. Erwin and I, my little brother, went there, and we're sitting there, and the titles come on, and my eyes just get bigger and bigger, and my jaw drops, and we're watching Robbie the Robot and the Morbius, Walter Pidgeon, on Altair 4. And we're about 20 minutes into the film when I feel a tapping on my shoulder. And I look up, and it's an usher who says, "Your mother is waiting in the lobby for you. You have to leave." Now, in 1996, I was 10 years old. And I said, no, I don't think so. You've got the wrong kid. So he said, "You have to leave. She's waiting for you." And I said, "No way." So 5 minutes go by, and my mother comes down the aisle and says to my brother and I, "We have to leave." And I said, "Are you kidding me? This is Forbidden Planet. Why?" And she said, "We have to go see Aunt Jenny." And I said, about the last reason in the world for leaving the premiere of Forbidden Planet will be to go see Aunt Jenny. But she said, "You're a little kid. You cannot stay here by yourself. You have to come with me." So 20 minutes to a half an hour into the premiere of Forbidden Planet, we had to go leave the theater and see one of the people I liked least on the planet. So I never forgot that. I never got to see it in a theater again. I finally saw it in black and white on a small screen on television some years later. And I never let her forget that. When she was near her passing, and she lived to be almost 101 years old, I went to see her at the nursing home, and I mentioned in 1956, you took me to see Aunt Jenny, took us out of the theater when we were watching Forbidden Planet, and almost 101 years old, she shook her head, smiled, and said, "You'll never let me forget that, will you?" And I said, "No, I never will."
It's true that kind of thing happens, because when I was a child, I was a huge Bond fan, and there was this guy in Ireland selling all of these movie posters. I mean, you're talking about posters which now go for thousands of pounds, and they were £5, £4, what have you. I bought Attack of the Crab Monsters quad. Heaven knows what that's worth now, because I don't think many exist. And I got these amazing posters, and I showed this list to my mum, And of course, I've never let her forget this either. And it's amazing what you hold on to. And I said, right, here's the list of movie posters. There was Thunderball for £15, Dr. No for £25, and, all these other posters. And she said, I'm not paying £25 for a piece of paper. And I said, no, I will pay you back. I will do whatever jobs you want. I will wash the car, mow the lawn. Please, could I have the money for this poster? And she says, no, but I'll give you the £15 for Thunderball if you walk the dog, you do whatever it was, So I did all of that. And about 6 months ago, there was this British TV program on called Antiques Roadshow, which is, I'm sure gets showed over there. It's a really interesting program. And on there, a guy came on with the Dr. No poster. And of course, I got the call from my mum as this was going on saying, oh, you've got that poster, haven't you? Because it went for, I think it was £20,000.
Wow.
And And I said, no, I didn't. And I thought, I know this is going to cause an argument, but do I need to remind her about that? But I thought, you know what? Same as you, Steve. I can't let it go. I said, well, actually, this is the story behind it. And I told her that. And she got so angry with me that we didn't speak for 3.5 weeks. And it's just one of those things. And, and for years, I've always had that at the back of my mind that, she didn't understand it. And I'm sure she, unless you're involved with this wonderful world of fandom, you don't quite get it, or you love your movie posters and what have you. But for years, that happened, and I didn't want to have an argument, but I thought, no, I can't let this slip because this is what happened. And this is why all the other stuff I've collected is important, and why I tell my children, this is important for this. This is why I bought this. This is the story behind this poster. And I love this. And the reason I'm saying all this is because, today, Steve, I want to talk about some of the stories behind some of the photographs. Just before we went on air, you were saying you had pictures of the most amazing, it's basically a who's who of the 20th century, let's be honest.
Yes.
Yeah. And we just want to have a little bit of a background on how you got to meet these people, because I myself have been very lucky, and I'm probably the last generation with Nick who is going to meet these kind of people. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, Nick and I were so privileged. And I was very upset. I emailed Nick last week. I only just found out that Kathy Burns had passed. Yeah. And Nick and I, because of my wonderful friend John Landis, had gone to the Bob's Basement. Now, we will be one of probably the last people to ever go there, because Bob wasn't very well at all, and I know still isn't. Yeah. But that day, Nick and I were treated like royalty by Kathy, who was so lovely to us, and obviously saw that we are just a couple of little boys, is all we are, fanboys. Yeah. That's what you are, Steve. Yeah, you are a fanboy. When I spoke to Ray Harryhausen, he used to say, the exact words were, we were talking about King Kong, and he said, at the end of the day, all I am is a fanboy. And he said, when I got to meet my pinup girl for 1933, it was one of the greatest moments of my life, when I stood there at the Empire State Building and I was invited by Faye Ray to be there with her. He said, it was unbelievable. And he said, my heart sang. This was from an 84-year-old guy at the time. It's incredible. But you never quite grow out of it, and it keeps you young. That's what keeps you young. The sense of Ray, as I said on this cast before, he turned around to me and he gave me my epitaph, because he said, Mark, do you know why you are the person you are? And I said, no way. Why is that? And this amazing thing. He said, because you've never lost your sense of wonder. And nobody has said truer words than that, but you are the epitome of the boy who never lost his sense of wonder, my friend. You are.
I'm 76 years old, but in my heart, I'm still 6 years old. And I don't.
You are still the boy in the banner.
I never want to lose that.
No,
I am.
Well,
Dave, I did spend 2 afternoons with Faye at her apartment when she lived in Century City, in a suburb of Los Angeles, and she was wonderful. I had written the lead article for The Girl in the Hairy Paw, which was the first book ever published about King Kong.
Yes, I want to get onto that later on, yeah.
Yeah, people will tell you that The Making of King Kong by George Turner and Orville Goldner was the first book, and in fact, it was the first book to be available to fans in the bookstore. But Girl in the Hairy Paw had been in production some 4 years prior to the making of King Kong coming out. The issue was we were going to be published by Prentice Hall, and they had a change in management who decided they wanted nothing to do with King Kong. So we had to look for another publisher, finally landed at Avon Books in New York, and that was why the delay. But we were the first book about Kong ever conceived. So when I was working on that, Ron Gottesman, along with Harry Gettle, edited the book. Now, I had written a series of articles for the Monster Times in 1972, which was the very first and only bi-weekly monster tabloid. And the very first issue had part one of my article on the making of King Kong. Well, I had a phone call from Ron and Harry. They were two college professors, Ron at Rutgers University, Harry at Indiana University main campus in Bloomington, and they wanted to take me out for lunch and tell me about a new book they were putting together about King Kong and discuss putting my work in the book. At any rate, after Marion Cooper had passed away, and to back up, Marion Cooper and I had corresponded intimately for the last 8 years of his life. He, of course, was the creator, co-producer, and co-director of King Kong. And Cooper and I never met, but we had an intense personal correspondence for 8 years, from 1965 until 1973 when he finally passed away. And he said, if you ever get out to LA, I'll introduce you to Faye. But he passed away, and I didn't get to LA for the first time until 1974. So Ron Gottesman, one of the authors of our book on Kong, said, well, I know Faye, I can put you in touch with her. So I wrote her a letter and said, Marion Cooper said if I ever got out there, he would introduce me, but sadly he passed away. And I still have these wonderful handwritten letters from Faye saying, no, absolutely. Let me know when you're coming and we'll get together. So we set up a meeting. I went to her apartment in Century City. She was married to a well-known surgeon, Dr. Rosenberg. And we got to the front desk and asked for Faye Ray, and I was told she's not here. About a minute later, she walked through the doors, and she apologized for being late for our appointment and told me that one of her best friends had just passed away, and she had gone to a memorial service for her. And I felt really bad. I said, look, we can do this another time or not at all. I don't want to intrude on your privacy. And I'll never forget, she was such a professional and such a lady in every sense of the word. She raised her hand and said, no, life has to go on. So we went upstairs, spent about 2 hours with her. I remember she asked me to go into the kitchen and get some cans of Coca-Cola for everyone. And being the klutz that I am, I dropped one can in the sink. It exploded and went all over the sink and her kitchen floor. And I thought, here I am with Faye Ray, and I'm making a wreck of her kitchen. So she laughed about it and said it was fine. But I remember she talked about Marion Cooper and Bob Armstrong, who both of whom she adored and stayed in touch with until they had passed away. She had lovely stories about Schoedsack. She was still very close with all of them. And I made the mistake of saying, well, what about Bruce Cabot? And she grew very quiet, looked down at her lap, looked up again and said, if you don't mind, I'd rather not talk about him. So I'm guessing that maybe he hit on her. and to be honest, who would not have hit on Faye Ray in 1933? But we had a lovely chat.
Yeah, Faye Ray was totally beautiful, and it's interesting. You know, obviously, as I've said, we're tangent-tastic here because I was going to ask you about that later on, but I'm really glad we covered it now because King Kong was on this week, and on Thursday on BBC4 they had an RKO night. And they had RKO, and then they had King Kong, and then they had the thing from another planet, which is great. And these are the kind of things you just don't get to see on terrestrial TV so much now. It was a brilliant night's TV. But in the RKO story, they were introducing, and they talked to Faye Ray, and she said and I'd never seen any of this footage before, and a young Ray Harryhausen was on there as well, Steve, and you could tell he was younger because although he didn't change throughout his life too much, his voice was a lot higher back in the day. When I knew it was hello, but in this one, his pitch was completely different, which kind of threw me because I thought that's not Ray. It was so strange. But they interviewed her, and Faye said at the time, she really didn't like the film, and she was invited along to the premiere, and she said she was really disappointed and told everybody that she didn't like it too much because she thought there was too much screaming in there. And I'd never seen this interview, and it fascinated me. But when I talked to Ray about Kong, and we know what a huge impact it had on, it basically made Ray the kind of person he was, and made him get into film and what have you. And he went on to work with his heroes as well. But it was just fascinating to see that there were all these sort of backstories, which, would have been lost, in the sands of time had it not been for these people like on this RKO story asking the question, which is kind of what you've done. And it's so important that we get to hear these stories, because without them, I always sometimes find the making of movies even more interesting than some of the movies themselves, because sometimes there's a backstory there. And Ray would tell me amazing stories about, how the amazing gates, when King Kong comes through, they were burnt and, gone with the wind because they needed fire, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, these are the kind of stories you must have grown up with and sort of logged in that wonderful cabinet of your mind, and fantasy, and locked them away. And, anything, my teachers always said to me, Mark is always interested in those things that interest him. And otherwise, he'll just, but he knows he'll get to know everything about something that he loves. And that's kind of like you, isn't it? If you get to love something, Steve, that's where you are. And you will go to the ends of the earth to try and find out just a little bit more about it, which I was going to touch on earlier on. Your brother, Erwin, was his love of fantasy as large as yours? Or did you sort of cajole him into going to these movies with you? Or was he quite happy to go along with you to these things?
My brother and I, Erwin is 3 years younger than I am, but my sense he's always been my best friend and still is. And I think we had the shared love of fantasy and science fiction, so I didn't have to do much cajoling. To this day, when I go out to LA, I pretty much line up who we're going to see, when, and where. And I'll ask him, are you sure you want to do this? And he said, absolutely. A real quick story. A couple of years ago, I'd been in touch with Nehemiah Persoff, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago. I was watching an episode of The Untouchables with Bob Stack, and there was Nehemiah Persoff, who must have done 6 or 8 episodes as gangsters, and I wondered, whatever happened to him? When did he pass on? Well, I went onto my computer on Google and learned he was still with us. So I did a little bit more research, found out that he had retired from acting and was now a painter and selling his artwork online. So I found an email, and I just wrote him a very brief message and said, Mr. Persoff, I've loved you, watched you my whole life, and just wanted to say thank you for the memories. And within 20 seconds, I had a response. It's like, oh my God. And so we started talking, and I said, where are you? And he told me somewhere in LA, between LA and San Francisco. And not being an idiot and not having any idea of what the drive time was, I said, I'd love to come in and see you and say hello. And he said, well, I'm about to turn 100 years old. I'm rather frail. Give me a holler, write me as it gets closer to the time that you're arriving or when you get out here, and we'll take it from there. So I emailed him when I arrived in LA, and I said, I'm here. And he started to beg off and said, well, look, again, I'm very frail. I just turned 100 at the beginning of August. I don't know if I can handle this. And I felt badly, and I said, look, I totally understand. It's just an honor to speak with you. And about 10 seconds after that, he said, well, when were you thinking of coming? So I said, well, how about next Tuesday at 1 o'clock? He said, fine. So it turned out to be a 6-hour drive each way from LA, where my brother lived near Santa Monica, to Nehemiah Persoff. And I said to my brother, look, you're doing the driving. I'm not going to force this on you if you don't want to do it. If you think it's too much, I totally get it. And he said, are you out of your mind? Of course I want to go. So we drove there and spent literally 2 hours at the feet of this great actor who regaled us with stories. He had total recall about the Actors Studio, 1948, New York, Lee Strasberg, and seeing this god of an actor doing his lines, who of course was Marlon Brando. But Nicky, as he asked me to call him, as he asked all of his friends to call him, was a dear man, and I was heartbroken when he passed away. And certainly I was not a close friend of his, but it was really cute. We met his wife, Thea, when we were leaving after 2 hours, and he turned to his wife and he said, in that rough drawl of his, he said, these guys are okay.
It's wonderful, isn't it? When it's a wonderful thing when your heroes become your friends.
Yeah.
And I think that is a truly, it's a wonderful thing when that happens, and you can talk to them, like we are with you, just as friends more than anything. But the thing that interests me, and what I'd like to ask you, obviously it's a who's who of who you've met. And I actually, when we did that article for We Belong Dead, I actually said, if they had a This Is Your Life on you, it would be the greatest horror cast in history, or the greatest fantasy cast in history coming onto the show. But who was the first actor you ever generally wanted to meet? Was it Buster Crabbe or something going back? Or
probably. I mean, I think the first actors that I actually met were Marty Milner and George Maharis when they were filming Route 66 in Philadelphia. That was, is, and always will be my all-time favorite television series, because Irwin and I were young when the show started, 14, 15 years old, and it was all shot on location all throughout the United States. And here were these two buddies, best friends in their Corvette, who would just go across the country and have these great adventures and meet people. And each Friday night when we watched it on CBS, I felt that we were sitting in the back seat of the Corvette with Todd and Buzz, George and Marty. So when I heard that they were coming to Philadelphia to shoot 2 episodes, I decided we're going to cut school. So I pretended to go to school. We got on the bus and went up to City Avenue at the Marriott Motor Hotel where they were shooting, and I saw the Corvette and all the camera trucks and the crew in the driveway of the motel. And we walked in. Now you have to remember, I was 15 years old, and there was a character actor named Murray Hamilton who had played with Jimmy Stewart in the FBI story Spirit of St. Louis. You may remember him as Death on the Twilight Zone with Ed Wynn. But I saw a man sitting across the lobby on the couch reading a newspaper. And I nudged my brother and I said, I think that's Murray Hamilton. So we walked over to him and I said, excuse me, are you Murray Hamilton? And I think he was so blown away that these 2 little kids knew who the hell he was. He invited us to sit down with him on the couch and spend about a half an hour talking about his career, and he was just a sweet man. And then we met George and Marty, and the climactic scene in this episode was when Marty is in a drug-induced frenzy, threatening to jump off of the Benjamin Franklin Bridge and commit suicide, jump into the traffic. And Maharis, his best friend, is saying, please, buddy, don't do that. I love you. And George invited us to come and watch them shoot that. So we stood on the other side of the bridge and we could see them, and I could hear just a bit of the dialogue. And then when we left the bridge, George came down and shook our hands and said, I'm glad you guys could make it. And now after all these years, that was 1961, and I'm still in touch occasionally with George Maharis by correspondence. After all these years, he's 93 or 94 years old. But I think the second actor I ever met was Richard Arnold, who, of course, not only starred in the first Academy Award-winning film, Wings, in 1927, along with Gary Cooper, but starred in one of the great fantasy films of all time, Island of Lost Souls. And I read in the newspaper that Richard Arlen was representing, I think it might have been Revlon, some men's perfume. And he was appearing at Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia. And so I went to meet him. And there's this picture I have. It's a terrible picture. It was raining heavily that day, and I was wearing a raincoat, and I think my hair was messed up, and I looked really not my best. But I have a picture of Richard Arlen and I, and he was quite the gentleman and was very nice. But Buster Crabbe was probably my first childhood hero, along with Hopalong Cassidy, Bill Boyd, and I don't know if you guys were able to see this in England, but there was a series in the United States called Space Patrol. We didn't really get that. We got Flash Gordon and we got Buck Rogers every holiday. So I grew up with Larry Buster Crabbe because, you know, we used to get them the way the spaceship used to go down, everything. They became part of our childhood, but we didn't get things like Space Patrol. Now you can get them, you know, on the ether and what have you, but not then, no. Well, I became a good friend of Edward Kemmer, who played Buzz Corey in the later years of his life. And I never got to meet Hopalong Cassidy, which is one of my great life regrets. I would love to have met Bill Boyd. But long story short, once again, I had a good friend, Alan Asherman, who was a writer, still is, and had interviewed Buster Crabbe. And I said, is there any way, since you know him, that we could get to meet him? So he said, sure. So I'm in Philly. Alan lived in Brooklyn, New York. And Buster was working as the swim director at the Concord Hotel in upstate New York. So Alan arranged for the three of us to go up and meet Buster and spend the day with him. So I remember this endless train ride to Manhattan and then a bus ride up to the Catskills. And being the square that I was at that point, it must have been 90 degrees and I was wearing a heavy sports jacket and a tie, sweating profusely. But there was Buster Crabbe and in his swim trunks. And I've got a picture, which I might have sent you, Mark, of the Erwin and I with Buster Crabbe in swim trunks. I've seen that one online.
It's great.
We spent hours with him that afternoon. Then he came back and bought us lunch at the cafeteria and was talking about Charles Middleton and Dr. Zarkov and Gene Rogers, of course, as Dale. And he had wonderful memories. And I remember we asked him about Captain Gallant of the Foreign Legion. And he told us that camels are the most obnoxious creatures on earth. They're always trying to reach around and bite you. So he was not thrilled with working with the camels, but he had a son, Cullen Cuffy Crabbe, starring with him on the show. And I remained in touch with Buster until he died. This was in 1967, I think, or 69, somewhere in there. And I remained in touch with Buster till he passed away, which I think was somewhere around 1980. But I remember in 1979 visiting friends in Baltimore, Maryland. And I was still living at home at that point. And I came back and I asked my dad on a Sunday night, were there any telephone calls for me? And he said, yes, Buster Crabbe called. And I said,
wow, that's great.
I said, no, really. Were there any phone calls? He said, yeah, really, Buster Crabbe called. And I said, Dad, please, anybody call? He said, I'm trying to tell you, Buster Crabbe called, asking for you. I think it took him about a half an hour to convince me that Buster Crabbe had really called. So it turned out Buster was appearing at a convention in Philadelphia, staying at the Holiday Inn at 4th and Art Streets. And he was going around the convention asking people, do you know Steve Vertlieb? And of course, everyone said, who the hell was Steve Vertlieb? I think my dad might have said the same thing. But in any case, Buster called, and he asked my dad, do you know Steve Vertlieb? He said, well, I hope so. He's my son. So I called Buster back the next morning. He was in town, and he said he wanted to see me. So we agreed to get together for dinner that night. And Buster took us out, and I remember he was like a Jewish mother. He felt that I hadn't eaten enough and he had eaten too much. So he started emptying some of his plate into mine and saying, "Here, eat." But Buster always said, the next time you go to LA, why don't you stop off in Scottsdale, Arizona, and spend some time with us at the house? And I was a poor boy, I still am, and it cost me enough to pay for my direct flight to LA. And I only had a couple of weeks. I was working in television at the time as a film editor and cameraman, an occasional announcer. And I had that prescribed allotted time allowed, to quote Dana Andrews in Curse of the Demon. So I kind of politely begged off. Now in retrospect, I wish I had taken him up on that. But I have lovely letters, handwritten letters from Buster, and he was always my first hero, and he still is.
Isn't it amazing? Can you imagine that happening now, Steve, with the so-called stars of today? Come back to my house, come and stay They have about 15 people who they don't even know themselves who share a house with them, looking after them now. Can you imagine this happening?
No, because
you were
now
so lucky to have that time.
Yeah, there's so many agents and representatives and people you have to go through. It's impossible. And I remember back around 1980 doing an article. I used to write a column for Cinemacabre magazine on film music, and I wanted to write a piece about Jerry Goldsmith. And so I did some research and contacted Goldsmith's representatives in LA. And I said, "Look, I'm doing a piece about Mr. Goldsmith, and I wonder, can you send me some stills to illustrate the article?" And the guy said to me, "Well, I can't, but you might want to talk to Jerry. He had some." So I thought, okay, I'll bite. I'm game. How do I talk to Jerry? So he gave me a telephone number, which I was convinced was another agent of some kind. So I telephoned the house, and a woman answered the phone, and I said, "Can I speak with Mr. Goldsmith?" And she said, "Well, Mr. and Mrs. Goldsmith are out for dinner. Can I take a message?" So I thought, well, okay, this sounds like a housekeeper, and I've reached his home. So I told her who I was, why I was calling, and I thought that would be the end of it. The next morning, I was lying in bed reading a magazine, and my telephone rang next to my bed, and I picked it up, and I said hello, and I heard a deep voice say, "Can I speak with Steve Vertlieb?" I said, "Speaking." He said, "Mr. Vertlieb, this is Jerry Goldsmith returning your call." It was like, oh!
That's incredible.
So
this is
post.
Yeah, was this post Planet of the Apes as well, which is one of the most groundbreaking, soundtracks in history?
Probably. This would have been in 1980.
Right, yeah. So
Planet of the Apes, I think, was 68.
67, 68, yeah. Because it was groundbreaking. It really was.
But I told him why I had called. I wanted some stills. And he said to me, "Well, I don't have any now. I just did a photo shoot. I'll be getting the pictures in about 3 or 4 weeks. Can you wait?" I said, "I'll wait." So he was true to his word. He sent me some lovely photographs, and I sent him the magazine article when it was published. And I still have just the loveliest letter from him thanking me for my kind comments, and he signed it Jerry. And I put that on my Facebook page every now and again. But it was a different time. It really was. At that point in time, it was a lot easier to reach these people without having to go through endless publicists and agents and front people. But you had mentioned Ray Harryhausen, and I knew Ray for almost 50 years. And the way I got to meet Ray was through my correspondence with Marion C. Cooper, who, of course, had worked with Ray and Mighty Joe Young in 1949. And he was still friendly with Ray. And I said, "How do I get to meet Ray Harryhausen?" Because I'd grown up loving Ray as a kid with 20 Million Miles to Earth, and It Came from Beneath the Sea, and Earth versus the Flying Saucers, and on and on and on. And he introduced me through correspondence to Ray. And so in 1966, I wrote Ray a letter. had a lovely letter back, and from 1966 until his death, we remained dear friends. Whenever I would go to a convention with Ray, he would either telephone me and say, "Why don't we have dinner?" He invited me to England to stay with he and Diana, which I never had an opportunity to do. My ex-wife at that point said, "Would you really go?" And I said, "Are you effing kidding me? Ray Harryhausen is inviting us to stay at his house, and I'm going to say no." I said, "Of course I would," but I never got over there. But whenever I would go to a convention, Ray, I'd hear this bellowing voice, "Steve!" And I remember one time, because I knew Ray rather well by this time, I can recall being at a convention, and I was walking with my luggage toward the elevator to go to our hotel room. And I saw Ray sitting in a chair surrounded by a lot of kids, a lot of fans who were talking to him. So I thought, I'm not going to ruin their time with Ray. I'll just walk by, check in, and talk to him later in the day. So I thought, discreetly past him. And as I'm walking past him, I hear him yelling, "Steve!" I turned around and we chatted. One time I remember it was in the afternoon and he was preparing to go out to dinner with Diana, as was I with some friends. And he said, "Where will you be later?" And I said, "I'll be in the hotel, probably having drinks with a bunch of folks." He said, "Well, I'll look for you when we come back." So later that night, I'm sitting with a bunch of friends, and we're at a table scrunched against the wall, and I can't move. My chair is against the back wall. And I heard somebody say, "Oh, look, there's Ray Harryhausen. It looks like he's looking for someone." And I said, "Yeah, I think that's me." And of course, the reaction was, "Yeah, right. Ray Harryhausen is looking for you. Sure." Well, the next morning, as we were checking out of the hotel, there's Ray and I together checking out. And he said, "Where were you? I was running around the room looking for you last night." So that's the kind of friendship we had.
It was lovely. One of my favorite things we ever did, I got Mary and her husband Vince. I didn't tell them that I was going to. Mary, you can tell the story to Steve, because you know it's just your face. I'll never forget it as long as I live.
Well, Mark decided to surprise us, so he met us at Tube Station, and we got on, we got off. We're walking for it seemed like an hour, and Mark runs. Mark doesn't walk. And I had a broken foot at the time, so I had a cast on. And I'm sweat's pouring down my face. He's taking us through all these places. And we walk up to this gorgeous house and walk up this giant flight of steps. And Mark knocks on the door, and Ray opens the door. And I was so overwhelmed that I hugged the poor man. I almost killed Ray Harryhausen because I almost knocked him over. I was just so in awe. And he brought us into the house, gorgeous house, beautiful man, told us stories for an hour. And being a fan, I couldn't say anything. I was speechless. I was just sitting there listening to him and his stories, and I'll never forget it, that Vince and I had known each other since I was 13 years old. So, we'd been through life together, and we'd, gotten married, moved all over the country and stuff. And to the day he died, I think that was the highlight of his life.
Oh my gosh.
Going to Ray Harryhausen, meeting him. It was tremendous. And he was so beautiful and welcoming, and he was a person.
Well, I had corresponded with Ray since 1966, but of course he lived in England and I lived in the U.S. here in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. So I'd never physically met him until he started touring the United States promoting his last film, Clash of the Titans. So I found out that he was going to appear at Temple University in Philadelphia. So I made a trip of not cutting school, but cutting work. And I drove to Temple, and there was a crowd of people in the amphitheater waiting for his appearance. but I thought I'd like to meet him privately before that happens. So I went where I was told the backstage was, or dressing rooms, or where the celebrities would wait to be introduced. And there was a rather formidable police officer standing in front of these double doors wearing a gun in his holster. And I walked toward him, and I could see him growing edgier, and he put his hand on his gun. And he said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I want to meet Ray Harryhausen." He said, "Well, you'll have to wait out there in the audience with everyone else." I said, "You don't understand. I know him. He's a friend." So he said, "Well, I'll walk in there with you. But if it turns out that you're lying, I'm going to throw you bodily out of here." So he opened the door. We walked through, and I saw this little table, and there were Ray and Diana sharing a cup of coffee. So as we approached, and I could almost feel this cop breathing down my neck, waiting to grab me by the shoulders and hurl me out of the building. And Ray stood up, and I was very nervous, and I said, "Mr. Harryhausen, we've corresponded." He said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Steve Vertlieb." And he turned to Diana, and he said, "Steve Vertlieb, my God, Diana, this is Steve Vertlieb," and gave me a bear hug. And
wow.
And I could feel the police officer fading away and closing the door behind him. But I was asked when Ray was touring with Clash of the Titans, he had made his first East Coast appearance in Baltimore. And he was set to do a show called An Afternoon with Ray Harryhausen, which lasted about 3 hours, which included his speaking, answering questions, and running film clips in 16 millimeter. And I was asked by the folks who ran the convention if I would share the stage with Ray because we were friends. So I said, of course. So I prepared an opening speech and introduction. And then there were Ray Harryhausen and I sitting together on stage for 2 or 3 hours in front of about 700 people, I think. And I took advantage of my being the one interviewing Ray because I knew we had a shared affection for motion picture music. He loved Max Steiner, of course, and Miklos Rozsa and Bernard Herrmann. We talked about them all. Well, when the show was over, I helped Ray pack up his models, put them into his little attaché case, and we walked out the door. I was with my then wife, Maria, and Ray walked out to the left where the fans were standing waiting for him, and Maria and I turned right, and as we turned right, there was a man standing there with a woman and a little boy. And he said, "Excuse me, are you the gentleman who was on stage with Ray Harryhausen?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "And you were talking about Bernard Herrmann?" I said, "Yes, we were." And he turned to his wife and his son and said, "I'd like you to meet Bernard Herrmann's daughter and grandson." And I clutched my chest and went, "Oh!" And I said, "Follow me." So we walked over to Ray, and I tapped Ray on the shoulder, and I said, "Ray, I'd like you to meet Bernard Herrmann's daughter and grandson." And Ray said, "Oh!" And so that was an exciting moment.
But again, Steve, that goes back to Ray never stopped being a fanboy, just like us. Yeah. He was a fan, and Herrmann was his absolute. He loved Roadshow, which we'll get on to. Actually, we'll get on to some music stuff later. But it just while we're on about Ray, that kind of sums him up. But Mary, going back to what I will never forget, because I was doing my usual thing of fixing Ray's TV or something, because he, sitting on the floor. I always had to fix Ray's TV every time I went round. Oh, I've lost Murder, She Wrote. I need it, and. So I would always have to try and fix his TV. And I remember looking round, and Vince was sitting. You know how little boys sit when they're just about to meet Santa Claus? Yes. That's exactly how Vince looked. And I remember looking at me, and his eyes opened, and he just nodded as if to say, "This is amazing," and it was just such a wonderful moment. Looking at Vince literally turned to a little schoolboy in front of me. That's exactly what it was like.
Vince was the shyest person you'd ever want to meet in your life, and that was just so amazing. He was, like I said, the highlight of his life.
But that's what Ray was like. Ray made everybody feel comfortable. I mean, he loved my eldest Mauve, and I'll never forget, Steve. We went there, and I took her there, and I said, if you're lucky, you'll get to sit and talk with Ray for a bit, and he says, "Oh, do you like movies, Mauve?" And his usual. And she goes, "Yes." And she goes, "What was that movie I liked, Daddy? It was about a man who had everything, but at the end of it, all he wanted was his sledge." And I went, "Oh yeah, Citizen Kane." And Ray just looked and said, "You like Citizen Kane?" And she said, "Yes, I loved it." And she loved The Searchers as well. And he mentioned, and he said, "Oh, what a special little girl." He said, "Would you like to see some of my friends?" And she went, "Yes." So he had this amazing office at the top floor of his house. And he by this time, he couldn't go up the stairs. So he had one of those chairs that you see in Gremlins that the lady goes up and he had one of those stairlift chairs. And Mauve looked at it, and of course, she'd never seen one before. She was only about 5, and she just went, "Wow!" And he was going up, and he says, "You want to ride on this, don't you?" And so he sat Mauve on his knee and took her all the way up to the top of the house. And then he said, "These are my friends. Which one?" And she goes, "Oh," and she pointed at Talos. And he said, "Do you want to meet Talos?" And she went, "Yes." And he just literally said, and I said, "Please be telling." He goes, "No. These are what I made these for children." He said, "I want Mauve to whatever she wants to play with, she can play with." And literally, she was holding the Cyclops, Talos, all of these amazing creations in her hand. And that's the kind of guy he was. And she's never, ever forgotten him. She always talks about him with such fondness. It's wonderful. But we all, thankfully, and it's a shame, Nick, that you couldn't have made it that time. But then again, we did go to see the Bob's Basement, so I tried to make up for it in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, Ray was one of the most lovely men I've ever met. And when I say to you, it's great when your heroes become your friends. That's exactly what we were. And he used to phone me and say, "I've got this movie." He was over the moon talking about Fay Ray. I got a movie, I think it was called Black Moon. It was a very obscure Fay Ray movie. And the excitement, because I got it from a movie fair, and I said, "I've got your Black Moon." He said, "Oh my word, come round." And he used to get deliveries of fresh fish from the market, from Billingsgate Market, delivered to his house every Thursday. So that was the day to go to Ray's. And he would have all these huge giant prawns and everything. We'd sit at his table and he'd talk about Hollywood, and then we'd go and watch a movie together. And the excitement that he had watching Black Moon after all those years was amazing. And as we say, he's just a lovely, lovely man and a fanboy.
He was like we are or were in the 30s, the mid to late 1930s. In First Fandom, there were the 3 inseparable friends, Ray Harryhausen, Ray Bradbury, and Fari Ackerman. And I got to know each of them as a dear friend in my own right. I knew Bradbury for almost 40 years.
Wow.
Went to his house many times. And it's funny, you talk about Harryhausen and his television. With Bradbury, it was his 16 millimeter projector. And I can remember he was all excited the first time I met him in 74, and he wanted to show me his gorgeous Technicolor print of John Huston's Moby Dick. Now, I was working in television at the time in the film department, so I worked with 16 millimeter. And Ray is putting on this gorgeous, magnificent tech print of Moby Dick.
Because he wrote the screenplay for it, didn't he, Steve?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He was tied with John Huston. He wrote the screenplay for that. He also wrote the spoken dialogue of Orson Welles in King of Kings, which is how he came to know Miklos Rozsa, who wrote the music. But as Ray is threading his projector and the film starts, I see a green scratch forming on the right of the screen. And I said to Bradbury, "Did you clean your gate?" And he said, "Excuse me, clean my what?" I said, whether you thread the film, the gate. He said, "Well, how do I do that?" I said, "Well, do you have any isopropyl alcohol and Q-tips?" So there's Bradbury running into the back room and grabbing me a bottle of alcohol and Q-tips. Oh. And I said, "Look, this is how you do it." So, and pardon me, my voice is starting to crack, but it was quite a moment. Here am I showing Ray Bradbury how to clean the gate of his 16 millimeter projector and protect his film of Moby Dick. Well, years later, I bumped into Ray at a convention. I hadn't seen him in years. And he was sitting talking with some people. And I said, "Do you remember back in 1974 at your house in Los Angeles when this obnoxious twit had the temerity to tell you how to clean your projector gate to protect your print of Moby Dick. And he pointed at me and said, "Was that you?" I said, "Yes, it was." So, and we remained. A year when I went out to LA, I'd go and spend an hour with Ray. He'd suffered a stroke, was not in great shape, but his daughter Z would always tell him, "Steve Vertlieb is coming to see you," and she told me he always got very excited. And he lived actually about 10 minutes from where my brother lives. And the last time I saw Ray, I remember we were there, and I told him, I said, "Ray, do you know how many you are loved by millions of people all over the world? How many people you've influenced and have read your novels and just changed their lives?" And he started crying. I saw a tear come down his cheek. And as we left the house, I turned around and looked at the house again, and I said to Erwin, "I have a feeling this is the last time we're ever going to see Ray." And about 7 months later, he passed away.
Oh.
I have my memories.
Yeah, this is the thing with again, I mean, I want to touch on this because this is one of the questions I wanted to ask you, because obviously we've talked about screen stars and everything, but I'd really like to know who your favorite writers were. I can imagine Lovecraft and everything would creep into it. But just while we're on Ray, the wonderful thing was that Ray Harryhausen asked me, who my favorite writers were, and I said Lovecraft, but I said specifically Ray Bradbury, who I know you're really good friends with. And he said, "Oh yes," he said, do you want to give me something to sign when I go over to see Ray?" Because it was the last trip he ever went to see Ray Bradbury on, because they would always meet up. And I said, "Oh yes," I said, "I've got my very first still I ever bought." I said, and it came from outer space. "Do you think you could get Ray to sign this? Because it's important to me, because it's my very first thing I ever collected." And he said, "Sure." And he went away, came back, and he said, "I've got something for you." He handed it to me, and Ray Bradbury there was a tiny little credit to him, because it was mostly Harry Essex had taken the joy from it and claimed everything for it. But in tiny letters, there was Ray Bradbury, and he'd written a huge arrow going down and said, "This is me. I actually wrote some of the dialogue, on this still." So it's a wonderful thing, which is actually behind me now as we sit, and to have that was amazing, because Bradbury is so important to me, from the Martian Chronicles to Something Wicked This Way Comes, all of these wonderful books, The Halloween Tree. The guy was a genius. But who are your definitive writers, Steve, would you say?
Well, my favorite writer is your favorite writer, I suspect, H.P. Lovecraft. I could not. I'd read Lovecraft and not be able to go to sleep. In fact, funny story, which I won't bore you with, but very quickly.
Steve, you're not going to bore anybody. Believe me, and you don't need to say a quick story. Just tell us how it is.
Well, I turned my little brother on to Lovecraft, and my favorite Lovecraft story is The Shadow Out of Time.
Yeah.
And so my parents had been away. I don't know where they were, but we were alone in the house. And it was going on midnight, and I was upstairs in my bedroom watching television, and Erwin was down in the living room by this huge drum table and lamp. And he was sitting on the chair reading The Shadow Out of Time. Well, what we both had forgotten was that my mom had the lamp on a timer, and at 12 midnight, the lamp would turn off. And so at midnight, Erwin is reading The Shadow Out of Time. I hear a click. I see the room turn to darkness, and I hear my brother scream and run up the stairs, and I was hysterical with laughter. But my favorite writer is Lovecraft. My second favorite writer is Robert Bloch, who also became a very close friend for about 30 years. I'd say after Bloch would be Bradbury, Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, Ray Russell, and James Herbert, who is a more recent writer.
That's an interesting addition there, Steve, at the end, because obviously, the myth, I completely agree, Last Man on Earth and all this kind of stuff, he's a proper genius, Richard Matheson, but Herbert's interesting. That's because he was very much around at the time when I was little, and I think it was The Rats or something was the big book that was out at the time. And I remember that cover and being absolutely, it's like a movie poster. Sometimes you go into a bookshop, you see a book, and you think, wow, and in your mind, like you did with the sounds that you heard from 20 Million Miles to Earth, you imagine what that book is like. And of course, he had a book called The Fog, which wasn't anything like The Fog. The movie. So, Herbert's interesting. So, did you get into him in his very early days?
I was working in television around 1976 at WTAF TV, Channel 29 as an editor, and later I ran the film videotape department, editor, cameraman, occasional announcer. But I was in the film department, and there was an adjoining engineering department. And the head of engineering, whose name I've forgotten, was getting things in the mail all the time, wanting them to promote them. And he said, look, I get these books all the time. I couldn't care less. I know you're into horror. I got this book called The Rats. If you want it, you can have it. So I said, sure. So I took it home and I started reading it. And along with Lovecraft, it was one of the most gut-terrifying things I'd ever read. And I followed up with Lair and all of the other books. And every time I went to Barnes and Noble, started looking for James Herbert. And I think I read every word that he ever wrote. Whenever I go to LA, I bring a James Herbert book with me and start reading it on the way to LA and on the way back. So he became my favorite writer in more recent years, if you will.
Yeah, that's really, because obviously, that's I Am Legend is one of my all-time favorite books. Did you ever get to meet Richard Matheson at all? Because obviously he wrote some great Twilight Zones as well.
I did. Matheson was a brilliant writer. He'll always be one of my favorite writers. The circumstances were not the best. I had gone to Fari Ackerman's Famous Monsters convention in Crystal City, Virginia. I think it was 1993. And I was going mainly to see Bob Bloch. And Bob was not in the greatest health at that point. He wouldn't have lived too much longer. He died, I think, in 95 of cancer. He was terrified of dying. But Richard Matheson's favorite writer was Robert Bloch. And so I was with Bob, and Matheson came up to say hello to Bob. And I thought, here I am with two of my favorite writers. And Matheson, I think, with all due respect, and I can't blame him, didn't have the foggiest idea of who I was and really couldn't have cared less. He just wanted a picture with his hero, Bob Bloch. But I asked somebody, would you take a photograph of Bloch, Matheson, and I? And he did, and it's still one of my favorite pictures. I think I might have sent it to you. But I corresponded with Matheson a little bit. I had sent him some of my poetry, and he told me, quite frankly, he was not interested in poetry. So it was not a long correspondence, but I think he was a genius. He'll still be one of my all-time favorite writers, and I cherish that photograph, but I was into him a lot more than he was into me. And he didn't know me from Adam, so I don't blame him for that. It was just a moment in time, or somewhere in time, if you will.
What was Robert Bloch like?
He
wrote Psycho.
Robert Bloch, aside from myself, had the worst sense of humor in the world. Would regale you with one pun after another.
No.
I mean, I've had people leave the room because of my puns. But Bob was a constant joke teller. He was not at all like his literary persona.
Wow.
And I remember I had corresponded with Bob starting around 1970. And when I made my first trip out to LA in 1974, he said, why don't you come out, spend the day with me? I'll take you on a tour of Los Angeles, see all the sights. And then at the end of the day, we'll come back to my house in the Hollywood Hills. You meet my wife, Ellie, and we'll have dinner. So I thought that sounds pretty nice. So here am I, my first day in Los Angeles, and Robert Bloch is our chauffeur, driving us all over LA. And he drove us to Fari Ackerman's house. I've got some wonderful photographs of Bob Bloch, Fari, and Irwin and I. But the highlight of the day was he drove us to Paramount Pictures and to meet George Pell.
Wow.
And,
Wow.
Tom was working on a teleplay for what would have been a CBS TV miniseries based upon H.G. Wells' In the Days of the Comet. And Bob was working on the teleplay with George Pell. So he said, would you like to meet George Pell? I said, of course. So we drove to Pell's office at Paramount. His name was on the door. And we spent about a half an hour with George Pell at Paramount. And I have one of my favorite pictures of Robert Bloch, George Pell, and I standing together in front of his desk at Paramount. As it turned out, CBS canceled the project. It never happened. But that was a wonderful moment.
Wow.
I was going somewhere with this, but I've totally forgotten. Anyway, we spent the entire day with Bob Bloch, and he was chauffeuring us all around L.A. And I still pinch myself that he was acting as a cabbie or an Uber driver for us in Los Angeles. And then we wound up back at his house that night. Dinner. Ellie made dinner. I know where I was going. And on his desk, and it was no accident, he had a couple of copies of Cinemacabre magazine, and that's the magazine that I was writing for at the time. And I'm fairly certain that in his day-to-day life, Bob Bloch did not have copies of Cinemacabre magazine lying on his desk. I think that was for my benefit, that he was a sweet man. And I asked Ellie at dinner, this is where I was going with that story. I asked Ellie at dinner, what do you think of Bob's work, his books, his horror novels? And she said, I've never read a single solitary word that Bob has written. And my jaw dropped. I said, you're his wife. He's a famous writer. You've never read a word that he's written? And I'll never forget, she said, I adore Bob. He's the sweetest man I've ever known. I love him to death. I prefer not to see that side of him.
Wow.
Well, because his stuff was so dark, she didn't want to know what was going on in his mind.
Yeah, he had a dark side, as do we all. She preferred not to see that side of him. She preferred to see the side of Bob as we had dinner that night, where it was one-liner after another. And one of his closest friends was Buster Keaton. And Bob told me that Keaton was one of the loveliest men he'd ever known. And he'd spent endless hours with Buster, and he adored him. And I think Buster was probably funnier than Bob, but Bob, like myself, had this endless stream of one-liners and had Ellie rolling her eyes.
That's amazing. And, because Buster Keaton, actually, some of his stuff is really quite dark, funny yet dark, and all best comedy is. And, normally the funniest people have, are quite insecure people themselves when they're on their own, which is, I've always found it interesting. Like over here we had Tony Hancock, who was very, loved by millions, but very, very dark and insular. And I think that kind of makes it. And obviously Monty Python have very dark sides to them, but that makes it all the more interesting, I think.
I love Python, particularly the parrots, the dead parrot sketch.
Yeah, yes. He's only sleeping. I was very fortunate. I got to meet just before a couple of them passed. I shot the Monty Pythons, and it was amazing because obviously they all got back together, and I managed to get my several books of theirs signed. Because Terry Gilliam, did a couple of books of amazing illustrations, and I got to meet Terry Gilliam through Ray. And he gave me his address and everything, and it was just wonderful. And I was just thinking, as you are, I can't believe I've got Terry Gilliam's telephone number in my phone. This is just mad. This is just crazy. And it's, I've talked about it once before, but one of the thrills of my life, and you would still be the same, Steve, I can imagine, is the fact that Ray gets his little red book out and he said, "I'll just make sure I've got your right number." And he looked at it, and I was next to Christopher Lee and Tim Burton. I just thought, you've made it. You read Ray's little red book. But, going on from writers, which is fascinating. Obviously, I'd very much like to congratulate you on your wonderful recognition for the Rosa Society this week. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, Mary has put this on the site. Mary, haven't you? I saw that on the Facebook.
Yeah. Yes, it's on Facebook.
Well, I was totally shocked. It was like the time I had a letter from Bill Clinton after he left the White House. I had an envelope from Clinton, and I nearly tore it up and threw it away because I thought it was a pitch for money for a donation. And I had found out where he had an office in New York, and mailed him a piece of poetry I'd written about 9/11. And I was about to tear it up when I realized that it not only did it say "Dear Steve" and was signed Bill Clinton, but he was talking about "For the Fallen," which was the name of the poem I had written. And I thought I could have torn this up. And it was a letter from a former president of the United States, and he admired my work and the words I'd written about September the 11th.
Wow. Oh my word!
Wow.
And forgive me, I'm 76 and I have surgery tomorrow. Remind me of the question.
No, it was while we're on, it was about. No, you're going to make us laugh, but let me just I was talking about your wonderful but let me just quickly interject here, because obviously I think Nick and Mary have made the huge mistake of having two guys who love to tell a story on today, but I'm so glad we're on together. But I just want, because I actually have a Clinton story which I must tell you about when she was just about to run for presidency with the guy who you finally got and forgotten his name, Small Hands. Anyway, I was asked, would I be interested in photographing Hillary Clinton? And I said, yes, of course. She could be the first female president of the United States. This is amazing. I can't believe I'm being asked. And it was by Waterstones, or a big book company over here. And they said, she's coming across with her autobiography. And, we're getting a few people to take some pictures. Would you like to come? I said, absolutely, I'll come. And they said, now this is going to be a little different from your normal pop star thing. We have to have all of your details, your telephone number, your email address, all of this for security reasons. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow, really? And they said, yes, give us all of your information, which included my my AOL, my telephone and what have you. Right. And I thought that, and I was on my way there, and my friend rang, and he said, where are you going? And I said, I'm just off to shoot Hillary Clinton. Now, obviously, that was meant in a photography way.
Terminology.
Yes, but I was so used to saying that, and I thought, oh crap, I've given all of my details out. Someone will be bugging the phone. And I became so paranoid. It was like Warren Beatty in the Parallax View. I just thought, what if they are listening? And I just said, I'm on my way to shoot Hillary Clinton. And I actually said, and my friend said, are you still there? And I went, yeah. And I said, but if anyone is listening, when I say shoot Hillary Clinton, I mean a photography way. I'm just on my way to go to school. And my friend thought I completely and utterly lost it. He said, who are you talking to? I said, anyone who might be listening. And he obviously thought that I'd taken a very strong drug or something, or was just, I'd lost it completely. And I said, no, you don't understand, Steve. I said, I think my phone might have been tapped. And he went, I don't know, whatever. And he put the phone down, and he just thought, I think he's drunk. And anyway, I got to the place where we were due to take some pictures. And I thought, yeah, you were being paranoid. It's absolutely ridiculous. I got to the top of the stairs. There was these two huge security guards at the top of the stairs laughing. And I said, yeah, I think that's him. And they'd been listening to the call.
Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah.
Gotta be careful what you say.
You've got to be so careful. But that was, my introduction to Hillary Clinton.
Well, the reason I mentioned Bill Clinton and almost tearing up the letter, not realizing it was a personal letter from him admiring my poetry, is that I got a message on Facebook from the gentleman who runs the Hungarian Hollywood Council. It was, as messaging will be, it was tiny. There was a photograph with the text that I just wanted to send this to you. And I almost said, okay, fine, and then went on to something else. Oh, well, let me click on the picture and see what it says. And it's a proclamation honoring Miklos Rozsa's birthday, and also talking about Steve Vertlieb, who has perpetuated Rozsa's legend, if you will, and continues to talk about his music and his career. And I thought, oh my God, here I am on a proclamation from the Hungarian Council in Hollywood, and my name is on the same page as Miklos Rozsa. So I was like, oh, clutching my chest, and I thought, how lovely. But I knew Rozsa for 27 years. Initially, I heard that Rozsa was appearing in Philadelphia at the Academy of Music with Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1968. He was going to perform his piano concerto, and the pianist was Leonard Pinario. So I had just started getting published and was very full of myself. And so I sent them a copy of the magazine and said, look, I write about motion picture music, and I'd love to meet Dr. Rozsa. So they arranged it. They gave me free tickets next to the stage for Irwin and I. And afterward, we were invited backstage, and there were some fans back there having Rozsa sign album covers from Ben-Hur and El Cid. And I introduced myself, and we waited till everyone had gone. And Rozsa was staying at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, a couple of blocks up Broad Street near the Academy of Music, which was where Eugene Ormandy and his wife had lived. So we're walking down Broad Street, and there up ahead were Leonard Pinario and Eugene Ormandy, and behind were my brother and I, and squeezed between us, Miklos Rozsa, 3-time Academy Award-winning composer. So we had a final time talking with Rozsa, but I noticed every now and again Eugene Ormandy would stop, turn around, and make sure that we weren't kidnapping his guest artist. But Rozsa and I remained in touch until his death about 27 years later, I think 1995, don't quote me. But we had a huge correspondence. He loved my poetry, God knows why. But I have endless handwritten letters from Rozsa. And I can recall one of the greatest experiences of my life. I was running the film department at Channel 29 in Philadelphia, and my telephone rang, and it was Harry Gettle, who had written The Girl in the Hairy Paw with Ron Gottesman. And he said, Carolyn and I would like you to come to Bloomington, Indiana, and stay the weekend for a film conference we're putting together. So I said, Harry, I'd love to come, but I can't get away. I'm up to here with work. I just don't see how that's possible. Who's going to be there? And he said, well, Molly Haskell, the New York film critic, will be there. And I said, well, I wouldn't mind meeting Molly Haskell, but again, I'm up to here with work. Who else is going to be there? He said, well, George Powell is going to be there. And I thought, oh my God, I'd love to spend time with George Powell. But again, I honestly don't see how I can get away. Is there anyone else coming? He said, yes, Miklos Rozsa. I said, let me call you back. I'm going to call the airport, book my reservations, and I'll get back to you. And so I went there. Irwin was living in LA by this time. So I flew to Indiana and stayed with Harry and Carolyn for the weekend. And I spent about 11 hours literally attached to Miklos Rozsa, just talking to him, hearing endless stories about Charlie Schneer and Ray Harryhausen and scoring Golden Voyage of Sinbad. And he
not happy about that?
He said,
because Ray absolutely adored Rozsa, and he was over the moon when he got. It's like when he got Herman to do his stuff. When he got Rozsa, he couldn't believe it. And again, going back to Ray being a fanboy, the joy he said, I couldn't believe he was scoring something that I'd done. And what I was putting on the screen was getting his treatment. And he said, to this day, I will always be indebted for that. And I love the fact that was Ray Harryhausen saying that. But he did love, he loved that score as well, Roadshow, didn't he, for Sinbad?
I didn't think Roadshow was happy with the way it turned out, though.
No, he was not happy about the way it turned out. And he told me that the musicians really were not interested in the music. They didn't think much of him. They didn't think much of film music per se. And they were reading the racing forms instead of rehearsing.
And there wasn't as enough people there, isn't it? Didn't they cut down the amount of people playing as well?
Because Charlie Schneer was money conscious and was counting the dollars and wanted to get through as quickly as possible. And when Roja wanted a second take, Schneer would say, no, that's fine, let's move on. But at one point, Roja told me that he berated the musicians. He said, look, you people call yourselves religious. You talk about going to church. Music is our religion. So let's get serious about it here. But he was never happy with the way the recording turned out, and always wished that they could have had a larger orchestra and time for retakes to get it right. Yeah. But as I said, I spent 11 hours with him. He regaled me with stories. And what I'll never forget is on Sunday, he was invited by the Miklos Roja Society, which had just begun and was based in Bloomington, Indiana, on campus at Indiana University, run by John Fitzpatrick. Now, I was not a member of the Roja Society. I didn't even know there was such a thing. And so I was not invited to this private lunch. So I'm standing with Harry's wife, Carolyn, as Roja is ushered into this private dining room. And about 20 seconds after the doors closed, they burst open again. And there's John Fitzpatrick, head of the Roja Society, literally running toward me. And I got scared. I thought, what happened? Is Dr. Roja okay? He said, yeah, we sat down. Roja looked up and said, where's Steve?
Wow.
Oh. Yeah, so I clutched my heart again, as I'm wont to do, and was ushered in and sat next to Roja. And John, in years later, still says to this day that when he remembers that weekend with Roja at IU in Bloomington, that no one got more out of it than Steve Vertlieb. And I'll never forget when Roja was getting ready to leave. He went to the airport separately. George Pal and I shared a limousine together for a solid hour, just me and George Pal talking about The Power, which Roja had written for George Pal, and driving to the airport, just the two of us, which was an incredible moment.
Wow.
But when Roja was leaving, he walked toward me and he clasped my hands in his. And he was like this up against my face. And he had these steely eyes, very intense eyes. And he held my hands and he looked at me and he said, I believe, or I feel that you are very sincere. And I damn near broke into tears. One of the greatest moments of my life.
That's incredible. That's really incredible. See, what was Pal like? Because I can imagine, he's made some of the greatest fantasy films of all time, like The Time Machine. Some really great films. What was he like?
He was very down to earth, no pretensions at all. He was like the rest of us. He was a fan. He was just a big kid. He loved sci-fi fantasy. He loved talking about it. He was extremely down to earth, very approachable, no pretensions whatsoever. And he told me that he had just given the audio tapes of the soundtrack to The Power to the Roja Society so that they could put it out on record and tape, because he had held on to those recordings. But he was a gentleman. He was a sweet guy. So I'd spent that morning with him in his office at Paramount with Bob Block. And then here we were in Indiana sharing a limousine ride for an hour to Indianapolis to the airport. So that that was quite a moment. But I stayed in touch with Roja until he passed away. And there came a point where he was losing his sight. He couldn't see anymore, and so he had to stop writing music. But I became very friendly with his daughter, Juliette Roja, who would read my letters to him and continue reading my poetry to him, which he loved. So that was quite an honor. And getting back to Bernard Herrmann, I had the honor of presenting a lifetime achievement, posthumously, of course, to Bernard Herrmann. The folks who ran FanX also had Monster Rally in Crystal City, Virginia, and they had a weekend there where they had Hitchcock was there. They were honoring her father. Veronica Carlson was there. Roger Corman was there. And the announcer who was scheduled to speak and introduce the guests to the audience had gotten sick. And so they asked me would I introduce the celebrities to the audience. So there I was in the back of the room on a microphone saying, and now, ladies and gentlemen, Veronica Carlson. And now may I present Roger Corman.
Amazing.
My buddy who's a film director, Bob Tinnell, came back to me afterward and said, was that you? I said, yeah. He said, I recognized your voice. But I was asked, would you present a Life Achievement Award to Bernard Herrmann and ask his family if they would attend? So I first wrote to Wendy Harlow, who was the young lady I met with the little boy and her husband. She was Bernard Herrmann's daughter, and she said, we're going to be in Europe, but contact my sister, Dorothy Herrmann, who lives actually in Pennsylvania, in New Hope. So she gave me her phone number, and I telephoned Dorothy, and I said, would you like to come? And she said, absolutely. So I did the presentation. I was introduced by Yvonne Manlor and Veronica Carlson, who was also a dear, cherished friend of mine. I was heartbroken when she died. But the two of them introduced me, and then I did my little speech, and Dorothy came on stage with her nephews, her sister's boys, and they made a lovely talk about their father, but it was quite a moment. And then I wrote an article 2 years later for Midnight Marquee magazine called Herrmann and Hitchcock, The Torn Curtain, about the relationship between Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Hitchcock. And I tried to be as fair as I could. Hitchcock will always be my favorite director, but I admit I was favoring Herrmann in the piece, but I was walking a fine line. I certainly didn't want to insult Hitchcock because I adore him, but I didn't care for the way that they dissolved their partnership on the set of The Torn Curtain, and I'm sure you've heard that story, where Hitchcock had gone to work for Universal and became an executive with Universal, and so had a financial stake in the company now. And the executives at Universal wanted a pop score for Torn Curtain. They didn't want symphonic music. And Hitchcock had something of an allegiance to Herrmann. They'd worked together since Trouble with Harry, and of course did Vertigo and The Man Who Knew Too Much, Psycho, North by Northwest, Marnie. So he said, Benny, I'm going to let you do this, but I have to tell you, it can't be your traditional symphonic score. It's got to be something the kids can buy, something with a hit song. So Herrmann said, trust me, Hitch. Well, Herrmann was Herrmann. And so Hitchcock, through his spies, was told that it was a very dark, brooding symphonic score. So Hitchcock walked unannounced onto the set, heard what Herrmann was doing, started berating Herrmann, screamed at him, sent the musicians home, and fired him on the spot. And they never worked together again. And later that evening, I'm told they had a fairly contentious telephone conversation. The score that he wound up using by John Addison for Torn Curtain was not a terrible score. It was okay, but it certainly didn't produce a hit song, and the kids were not running out to their local Sam Goody's record store to pick it up.
But not many people went to see the movie either, Steve. Let's be honest, because Torn Curtain is not Hitchcock's best entry. That's for sure.
It's not, and I love Paul Newman, but he was not your traditional Hitchcock hero.
There's one great shot where the dress comes down like the blood. That's the one shot you remember. Whereas normally you'd remember about, North by Northwest, you'd remember a dozen scenes. But with that, it tended to be, one or two. I don't think he was firing on all cylinders on that one, to be honest.
Well, the best scene in the film, I think, is the killing of the KGB agent who's going to turn in Paul Newman, who is not a killer. He's a college professor or a scientist, I've forgotten which. But he knows that if he doesn't stop this Russian agent, that his life wouldn't be worth a damn. And so with the help of this housekeeper, they're trying to kill the KGB agent. And Hitchcock said he didn't want any music under it. Well, of course, Herman ignored him and wrote music to go with it, which was eliminated from the final film. But there's a documentary about Herman and Hitchcock, and it runs that scene in the film, and under it, the music that Herman had scored. And the difference is like night and day. I mean, it's a great scene, even without music, but it would have been 20 times better with the music that Bernard Herrmann had envisioned for it.
I can imagine. Before we leave music, Steve, this is really important. Could you just, obviously, I literally still can't get my head around who you've got to know and what have you. Now, I've been incredibly lucky, but it's not even in the same ballpark as yourself, because you got to meet, your heroes as well as ours as well. And you knew James Bernard and John Williams. Can we just talk about those two? Because they're incredibly important to fandom and the people who listen to this cast.
Well, I also, as you know, knew Peter Cushing.
Which we'll get onto later. But it's just the music side of things. I find while we're talking about Ruska, it'd be interesting to hear about your relationship, with Bernard and with Williams, because they're two giants.
Well, I met Jimmy Bernard at a convention in Baltimore, and he was a last-minute addition. They were having a Hammer convention, and I can't recall who was supposed to be there, but whoever it was either grew ill or had another commitment. And so James Bernard came over to fill in. And being a music nut, when I heard James Bernard, I was thrilled. I said, I want to meet him. So Jimmy and I spent a lot of time together. We had dinner together. I stayed in touch with him until his death through correspondence. I have lots and lots of handwritten letters from Jimmy. And he said, don't call me James, please call me Jimmy. We became so close that at least once a month for years, on a Sunday morning, I'd receive a telephone call from England. And I'd be sitting in my shorts in a bathrobe, unshaven, watching the news. The telephone would ring. I'd say hello. And he'd say, hello, Steve, it's Jimmy, calling from London. I was told that was the worst British accent of all time.
Oh, that's quite good.
But Jimmy and I were dear friends, and he was having difficulty. For a long time, Jimmy had retired from scoring. He'd had a personal tragedy in his life and just didn't want to go on. But he finally came back, and he wrote the music for Nosferatu, which had been recently restored, which is a brilliant score. But he told me that the agent he had in Britain was a sweet old guy, but had no chutzpah or gumption, and was basically lazy. And Jimmy said he wanted to reach a United States audience. Could I help? So I said, I'll try. So I was very friendly with Elmer Bernstein through correspondence, and I wrote Elmer and told him about Jimmy and said, do you have any suggestions? And I remember Elmer writing me back this lovely letter and saying, I'm about the last guy in Hollywood to ask. He said, I'm a dinosaur. It's a wonder that I'm still writing music, that people allow me to write music because the times have changed so dramatically. It's all rock and roll. And what I write is old-fashioned symphonic music, and I'm lucky to get an assignment. So he said, I appreciate your asking me. But he said, I personally wouldn't have a clue. I count myself as very fortunate to still be working in Hollywood. So I told Jimmy that I reached out to some other people, but suddenly I'd heard rumors that Jimmy had passed away. And so it ended. I was heartbroken. I was hoping that had not been the case. It turned out to be true. I think he had a heart attack in his apartment in Chelsea. But he was a lovely man, and we had grown very close over the last number of years of his life.
It's interesting when you said that, Steve, because obviously Elmer Bernstein was used by John Landis for Animal House because he wanted gravitas on 4 scenes, and he said, "Who can I get? I don't want rock and roll because the whole movie was about rock and roll. I want something with gravitas." And of course, the Faber theme and everything was Elmer Bernstein, and it really did add to the film. But we're talking just before we leave James Bernard. I mean, did he ever say? Because obviously he did. Before Williams did the incredible, music for Jaws. Bernard had done it with Dracula because he went da da da, which was just Dracula, and he thought, well, what am I going to do? Oh, I'll just say Dracula and put it to music. I mean, did he ever talk about his Hammer stuff? And because he literally did the music for all the great Hammer films of that period.
He did. Jimmy was very modest. He didn't take himself all that seriously. I mean, he was a total professional. He took everything he did certainly very seriously, but he was very self-effacing and kept thanking me for finding value in his work, as did Hugo Friedhofer. I have a beautiful letter from Friedhofer expressing amazement that I even knew who he was and valued the scores for the films that he had written, like Barbarian and the Geisha, Best Years of Our Lives, Soldier of Fortune, Boy and a Dolphin. And Jimmy was much the same way. He professed astonishment that I would value his music. But as far as John Williams, I had loved John Williams. I was aware of John Williams when I was 12 or 13 years old. In 1959, there was a CBS detective series on each week called Checkmate, about a detective agency, and it had Anthony George, Doug McClure, and Sebastian Cabot. And the music was by a guy by the name of Johnny Williams. And I'd listened to the theme every week and loved it. And I thought, who the hell is Johnny Williams? And then the next year, he scored Alcoa Premiere, hosted by Fred Astaire on ABC, which was an anthology show, wrote a lovely theme for that. A year after that, wrote the theme for Wide Country with Earl Holliman on NBC. And by that time, I was beginning to know and look out for the music of Johnny Williams. So I followed him throughout the 60s. And then somewhere around 1973, when he scored Jane Eyre for television with George C. Scott, he was now John Williams. And I remember thinking, I love this guy, but there's something different that I'm hearing in the score for Jane Eyre. He has matured as a composer. This is more serious music with quotations around it. And then 3 years after that, or 2 years after that, came in 1975, came Jaws, and I loved that. And by time Close Encounters of the Third Kind came around, I was totally blown away. Now, John Williams, literally, after a few years, became my last living lifelong hero. All of my other heroes at this point had passed on. I'd become friends with a lot of them, most of them. But the one guy I always wanted to meet, my last living hero, was John Williams, and it was impossible. By this time, he was protected by everyone, agents, representatives, everyone was protective of John Williams. It was impossible to get to meet him. I tried for years. I wrote letters here and there, wherever I could think to contact, and I was always blown off. He appeared at the Academy of Music at one point, and I got backstage tickets to go meet John Williams. I dressed up. I brought him a folder of my work, and I was told later he was tired and went back to his hotel. I did meet Vic Damone, who was on the same program with him that evening, but John was a no-show. So I was heartbroken again. We even drove to his hotel, found out where he was staying, and I gave my packet of information to the desk clerk with my name, address, and phone number. I said, please give this to Mr. Williams in the morning when he checks out. Well, moving on, in 2010, 12 years ago, and we've come full circle, I developed a heart problem and had to have a major open heart surgery with double bypass and valve replacement. And I didn't think I would survive it. I remember in tears looking around my apartment with all my collectibles and posters and the photographs of the heroes I'd met and known over the years. And with tears streaming down my cheek, I said goodbye and thank you for the happy memories, never having any expectation of returning home. Well, I did return home, and my brother, as a reward, said, why don't you come out to LA and stay with me for a couple of weeks this summer? Well, as it happened, that Labor Day weekend, as he does most every Labor Day weekend, John Williams was appearing Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at the Hollywood Bowl doing a concert of his work. I wrote a letter to his representative with his agency. I won't say his name. Even if I liked him, I wouldn't say his name. Like him, I wrote this heartfelt letter telling him basically I've been writing about film music for a half a century, published in books and magazines. I adore John Williams. He's my last living lifelong hero. And I came very close to dying just a few months ago. And it would mean so much to me to meet him. I said, I don't want to take his time. I just want to shake his hand and maybe get one picture with him. And it would mean the world to me. And I thought it was a very heartfelt letter. And he totally blew me off and wrote back a very short, demeaning letter saying, look, kid, everybody in the world wants to meet John Williams. I appreciate that you want to. Sorry you had this thing, but it ain't going to happen. So I talked to Juliette Roadshow, who I had a relationship with. As I said earlier, she used to read my letters and my poetry to her father when he could no longer see. So John Williams had often performed the work of Miklos Rozsa at concerts, doing Ben-Hur, El Cid, Lust for Life, Spellbound. So Juliette, as it happened, was going to the concert. I said, well, Juliette, we're going to be there. Are you going backstage? She said, well, I can. I said, well, is there any way you could introduce me to Maestro Williams? She said, of course. So
wow.
Basically went over this guy's head, which he came to bitterly resent, as I found out some years later. But anyway, we were backstage. We walked through the doors. I kept waiting for the door to be slammed in my face. I thought after all these decades of wanting to meet him, something will happen at the last minute. But we got through the doors backstage. I was at the back of the line, and I looked, and at the front of the line, there was John Williams, talking to people and smiling and shaking hands, and I started to cry. And I said, oh my God, there he is. And my friend Les Zador, who is the son of Eugene Zador, another composer who had orchestrated much of Rozsa's work and written his own symphonic pieces, said in Les's usual loving way, what the hell do you want me to do about it? Anyway, I was onto the front of the line, and Juliette spoke with John and then introduced me and said, this is my dear friend, Steve Vertlieb. And I shook his hand, and I told him that I had recently recovered from open heart surgery, and this was basically my first trip out. And there's a series of photographs. My friend Les was taking photographs nonstop, and there's John Williams looking angry that I'd suffered heart issues and nearly died, and his astonishment with his mouth open that I was here, healthy, talking to him. Then he put his arm around me, and my brother was taking pictures. Les was taking pictures. Juliette Roja was taking pictures, and John, who rarely, if ever, laughs or smiles, said, "Oh my God, look at all the flashbulbs going off," and had this huge shit-eating grin on his face. And it's one of my all-time favorite pictures of John Williams with his arms around me, grinning. And I have a lot of pictures, and I got to see John 5 different times. The last time I saw him, without belaboring the point, his agent, now I had seen John knew me, and whenever John would come out of his dressing room and he saw me, he would go, acknowledging my being there. And he's a sweet man. He really is. But the people around him are less so. And this one gentleman said to me, John is tired. He's going into his dressing room to rest for a few minutes. He'll come out again. After that, I said, I totally get it. Please tell him to take his time. I'm not going anywhere. So he turned his back to me and then turned back around as though a light had gone off in his mind. He said, "Who are you again? What's your name?" And I said, "Steve Vertlieb." And at that point, he said, "You're leaving. Out of here. I want you gone."
Wow.
Yeah, really. He was
wow.
that resentful after all those years that I had gone over his head, and it had been with John 5 different times and had lovely conversation. I gave him my article, my magazine article about Herman and Hitchcock. Now, this time we had been invited back by David Newman. John, generally at the Hollywood Bowl, conducts the second half of the concert. The first half of the concert, to let him get some rest, is David Newman, the son of Alfred Newman, the great composer. And David has become a well-known composer in his own right. Most recently, he did the orchestrations for Steven Spielberg's remake of West Side Story. So I know David slightly, and David had invited me backstage to come and see him after the concert. So I'm being almost forcibly thrown out of the bowl by security. And I started walking toward David Newman's dressing room, and the security guard barred my way with his arm. And I can be a pretty arrogant son of a bitch if I have to. And I got on my high horse and I said, "Excuse me, David Newman invited us back here." "Oh, okay." So he let David for a bit. But I was upset that I couldn't talk with John. And again, I don't blame John. He's a sweetheart. It's the people around him who are understandably protective of him. But I thought, I'm not a schmuck. I have some credentials. I've adored film music before anyone put a name to it or who knew what it was. I was writing about film music in 1969, for Christ's sake. It was only in the 70s that serious criticism of film music began to appear in print. So, I thought I have my credentials, but
you do have your, and there's no point even wasting time discussing people like that, although sadly they do exist, and I've encountered that kind of thing myself. But, more importantly, throughout the years, Steve, you have got to meet the people who we only ever see. I've been incredibly lucky in the fact that I've got to meet people like Christopher Lee and, become friends with Karen Monroe and, Victoria Carlson, who you love. And I've been incredibly lucky, but you have met the true silver screen heroes, of horror and the horror silver age, so to speak, and the Prices of this world. But you talk about Cushing, and every interview I've ever done with anyone who's ever worked with Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing, they're always sort of weary about discussing Christopher Lee because, like when I interviewed John Richardson, he was saying he was so rude, and when he was beating me up on screen, he really was beating me up, and I really disliked him, whereas you talk about Peter Cushing, nobody in all the people I've interviewed have ever said a bad word against him, said he is the most genuine, lovely person they have ever met, and was so unassuming. And you say that yourself, yeah?
I corresponded with Peter. I was given the address of his personal secretary, and I would write letters to him, and she would give him the letters, and he would write me back. And I recall when his beloved wife, Helen, passed away. He wrote me just the most heartfelt, painful letter of grief. And it was just so incredibly open and honest. And I cried when I read it, and I publish it periodically. But he was a genuinely sweet, gentle soul. He loved art. He loved, like Boris Karloff, he loved gardening. He was just a sweet man, a genuinely gentle soul. And I went to meet him. I heard he was appearing at Barry Ackerman's famous Monsters Convention in New York in 1975, and I thought, I've got to go. And so I went there, and I can remember the elevator doors opening, and there was Peter Cushing. And I immediately ran up to him before everybody else enveloped him. And I said, Mr. Cushing, you and I corresponded for a number of years. And he said, what's your name? And I said, Steve Vertlieb. And he was adorable. He said, oh, yes, you used to write me with your brother, just like Laurel and Hardy.
Oh, wow. Isn't it wonderful that these people remembered as well, Steve?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, can you imagine, you know, most of the so-called stars now wouldn't even see any of these kind of letters because they would go through several people who would probably not even show them.
It was a different time. And although I'm getting old, I don't know how much more time I have, not to get morbid, but I'm 76 years old and I'm having open heart surgery tomorrow morning. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be here, if I'll survive this or not.
You will.
Morning. I hope I do. But what I'm getting at is I was born in a different time. I was born in 1945, and for my particular interests, it could not have been a better time to have grown up, when I could see all of this stuff and when it was not all that difficult to reach these people. Interestingly, I did meet Chris Lee very briefly. I was not able to get a picture with him, which I desperately wanted. But I knew someone, another writer, who knew him. And I wrote him a letter. Actually, I had written him when he lived in LA, and he was a neighbor of Robert Bloch's. And I said to Bob, if I send you a letter, would you give it to him? He said, of course. So I have a lovely letter back from Chris Lee thanking me for enjoying his work. But at this point, I had said to this other writer friend, I'd like to write to Chris again. If I write him, would you forward it to him? And he said, of course. So I wrote Chris a letter, and I included a couple of 4x6 photographs of me with Veronica and with Caroline Monroe. Well, segue 3 or 4 months later, and I'm standing in a long line to shake Christopher Lee's hand and have him sign the book. And he looked up at me and he said, I know you. And I was almost embarrassed. I thought, well, Mr. Lee, we've never met before. I mean, I'm flattered, but you must be confusing me with someone else. And he looked up at me and he said, no, you sent me those photographs with you and those lovely ladies. And I thought, oh my God, he does know who I am. He remembered the photographs of me with Veronica Carlson and Caroline Monroe. And I guess he has had a photographic memory, but I was very touched that not only did he read my letter and see the photographs, he remembered me.
It is amazing because that kind of thing happened to me because I was lucky enough to meet him several times, and he had a book, Tall, Dark, and Gruesome, that he'd had out, and I was there again taking his picture for the launch of this book, and I got talking to him, and I discussed, because I had some time before everyone milled around and started when they were forming the lines for it to be signed, that he was related to Ian Fleming, and I discussed that, and was he approached to do Dr. No, and it was lovely. And then he said, oh, have you got, again, because a lot of people thought he was Italian. Nobody thought he was really British. And he said, you've obviously had the same problem I have. And we've discussed this several times where people think I'm Italian or French. I mean, nobody thinks I'm British, especially with this accent. And he went off and, he was talking about, his history and his family history. And we talked about the time when I said, I remember watching the making of Dracula AD 72 and you'd gone looking for Vlad, the Impaler and all that, and you were sitting there with your wife talking about it. He said, oh, yes, it still fascinates me. And about 2 and a bit years later, we were at Pinewood, and it was for a James Bond event, and he was there obviously because he was Scaramanga, and Carol Monroe was there, and Honor Blackman, and I got this wonderful pictures of three of them just laughing, and he said, "You're the chap who's into music, aren't you?" And he remembered, this is 2.5 years, and all the people that he met. And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "You're the non-Italian who likes music." And I said, "That's right." And he said, "I'm recording a heavy metal album soon." I went, "Seriously?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I've been asked to sit on the front cover with a big sword." And he said, "I'm going to be doing some operatics to heavy rock. How's that grab you?" And I just thought, isn't that wonderful? That he did that, And I have a lot of time for Christopher Lee. I always thought he was quite funny, but it's amazing how some of the other people, didn't really take to them. But did you Vincent Price was someone else who you wrote to?
I got to meet Vincent. I didn't really know him, but a friend of mine in Baltimore had connections at WJZ Channel 13, and he said Vincent Price is going to do an interview show in the morning. I was able to get us into the set. Would you like to come? So I said, of course. So I drove down to Baltimore and took the train. And there was Vincent Price, and along with Leonard Maltin and Gina Lollobrigida. I never
That doesn't come into the conversation normally, Steve. Just, I love the way you just slightly dropped it in there. Yeah, fantastic.
Well, I had a lovely chat with Leonard Maltin, and we compared notes about film history and our love for film. I confess that I was utterly terrified of Gina Lollobrigida and could only stare at her in male awe and admiration. Didn't have the nerve to say a word to her. But Vincent was very friendly. He put his arm around me. I had an afro, which friends called it Jewfro, because I am Jewish. And there's some lovely shots of Vincent Price looking at my fro as though he were Dr. Phibes preparing his next meal. Vincent was extremely friendly. I said, can I send you some photographs and have you sign them? And he said, of course. He gave me his home address, and I wrote him a letter, and I sent him a bunch of stills on more than one occasion. And he was true to his word, and he sent back all the autograph pictures beautifully inscribed to me. So I only met him for a few moments, but he was lovely. And I did want to talk about Veronica Carlson.
Yes. We sadly lost, yeah. We sadly lost Veronica. She's lovely.
Yeah, we did. I was heartbroken. I couldn't believe it when I heard it. In 1990, I was at a convention. I'm guessing either Crystal City, Virginia, or Baltimore. And again, I'm very shy usually. And I saw Veronica Carlson. I remember being at the Regal Theater in 1968 and watching her for the first time in Dracula Has Risen from the Grave and falling head over heels in love with her and thinking that she was the most exquisite creature that I had ever seen in my life. Well, here I am in 1990, and there's Veronica Carlson surrounded by dozens of fans, and she's having a conversation with everyone. And I didn't know her, had not met her, never been introduced to her. And I was just walking by, and I made eye contact with her, and she began talking directly to me. And I became somewhat self-conscious and thought she couldn't be talking directly to me, but she was. I don't know why, I don't know how, but I caught her eye, and we started chatting one-on-one. So I moved closer to her, and I knew she adored poetry. So I told her I'm a poet, and I write. I had my newest piece with her, which I asked, may I give this to you? And she said, of course, I'd love to read it. And it was a poem. It was called Orphan of the Night, and it was about a little homeless girl walking the streets of New York in the darkness, having no place to go, looking for shelter. So I handed it to Veronica. And several hours later, I was walking in the hotel, and Veronica Carlson was walking toward me. She grabbed my arm, and she had long nails, and she pinched my arm. And I was startled. I said, "Why did you do that?" She said, "Because you made me cry."
Oh.
That's wonderful.
It was the beginning of our friendship. We became extremely close. I mean, she was a dear, dear friend. I have lots of letters from her. She would telephone me all the time. And whenever I was ill, certainly when I had heart surgery 12 years ago, when I went through my divorce, Veronica was always calling me on the telephone, asking me how I was, asked me to fill her in. And when this local filmmaker, Craig Jameson, decided that he was going to make a feature-length documentary about my life called The Man Who Saved the Movies, he asked me who I could get to be in the film. Could I ask Veronica Carlson? And I said, well, I don't want to infringe upon our relationship. That might be just a little bit pushy. We'll go ask her. So I telephoned her and I said, would you be in this documentary? And she started laughing and said, of course, Steve, I'd love to. She was a guest at a convention and she interrupted her duties and sat down in a private room for about a half an hour and was interviewed by Craig. And I have the footage. I don't know if the documentary will ever be finished at this point. I'm inclined to doubt it.
I actually sent the link through to Nick and Mary. I mean, it really does need to be released.
Yeah,
it really does need to be released.
saw
For anyone
the
out there.
I saw the clip with Veronica, and it's wonderful. It's gorgeous.
Oh yeah.
The interview, he has published the interview footage, some of the interview footage for about 10 minutes worth, and I have put it on my Facebook page from time to time. But she talks about Hammer and her relationship with Chris Lee and Peter Cushing. And then they ask her about Steve Vertlieb. And she just starts laughing. And she said, I adore Steve. He knows everybody.
Well, that's exactly, which I think is a better title for the film, to be honest. And I've always loved that. But Veronica Carlson remained beautiful. Just before lockdown and what have you, I shot one of the last conventions she was at in Westminster, and she was still beautiful to that day. I mean, but not just a beautiful looking one, but a beautiful person, full stop, who would always have time for everybody. I always thought she was one of the nicer people at the conventions, and still beautiful, as I say, to this day.
I thought she was a dear friend of mine. We shared many intimacies. Interestingly, her husband, Sidney, who passed before her, and I don't know, maybe I shouldn't tell the story, and certainly can edit it out. But the first time I ever spoke with Sidney on the telephone, I called Veronica to say hello. And Sidney answered and said, who is this? And I said, my name is Steve Vertlieb. I'm a friend of Veronica's. He said, hold on. And I could hear him in the background saying, Veronica, it's one of your little fans on the phone. And I was really hurt by that. And when she got on the phone, I told her and I said, I hope you don't feel that way. And she said, oh, of course not. Don't be silly. That's just Sidney being Sidney. But years later, interestingly, he grew to accept me. And not long before he passed away, we had a wonderful conversation on the phone, just Sidney and I. And by that time, he'd come to regard me with a degree of respect as being a fellow professional. And we were talking about his health and and I wished him all the best, but he came to be something of a friend toward the end.
Well, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Around. It's interesting. Just before we go, Mary, just to go back to Gina Bridget, I'll quickly tell you something. So, again, it was one of her last visits over here, and I was there with my camera, and she was due to come across, and I forgot what it was. It was some movie, or it was a documentary or something. I can't remember what it was because I did so many. And she was walking towards me, and I thought, this is Gina Bridget again, one of the most beautiful women who's ever walked the earth. And one of my friends who was Italian had said that Gina Lollobrigida meant two beautiful mountains, right? And I just thought, I wonder if that's true. And I was just about to ask her when one of the security guards took her away. And I'm so glad he took her away, because obviously that's not true at all. And it was this Italian friend winding me up. So thank goodness I didn't turn around to her and say, because unlike you said you were quite shy, Steve. I've never really suffered from that, sadly. And the guy will back that up. And sometimes I just I will go in there and and I was just about to say so. I saw Gina. Does it mean two beautiful mountains? Thank goodness that didn't happen. but there you go. But Mary, you were about to ask something. I didn't mean to interject there.
I just wondered, can you tell a story about Veronica Carlson watching the Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed uncut version?
Yeah, interestingly, when I wrote my tribute to Veronica, and I wrote that up in my tribute, and it was partially published by File 770, which is put out by Mike Lyer, and they are a multiple Hugo Award-winning fan web magazine. He eliminated that portion, and I asked him, "Why did you eliminate that?" He said, "Well, it could be perceived as creepy." So I thought, okay, you're the editor. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But basically, what happened was Veronica and I were very close. Whenever I would walk into a convention, she would rear her head and yell across the room and laugh and say, "There's my Steve." So we had a deep and lasting friendship. I'd heard the stories that the rape scene was put in at the very last minute by Hammer, that Dr. Frankenstein was going to rape the character portrayed by Veronica Carlson. And it was seen not as a sexual rape, but Dr. Frankenstein's means of controlling her, of frightening her to the point that she would be submissive and do what she was told to do. But she was horrified. Peter Cushing was horrified. Neither wanted to do it. Terry Fisher didn't want to shoot it, but he was told by the executives at Hammer, just shoot it. It won't be seen in America. It's for the European audiences. But Veronica was shaking in terror. Peter, at the end of the scene, hugged her and apologized and said, "I'm so sorry." Well, the scene was cut. It was never seen in the States. It was restored just before the convention in Baltimore. Excuse me. And they were having a screening of it, and Veronica felt pressured to go into the screening. She said, "I really don't want to see that scene. I've never seen that scene, but it's Peter, and I feel I should be there in the room." So the lights went down, the film came up, and I sat directly behind Veronica. And when that scene came on, I reached for her hand and held it in the darkness. And as the scene went on, she held my hand and grasped it harder and harder. And then I let her hand go at the end of the scene. Anyway, the film ended, the lights came up, and she turned around and saw me, and she said, "I just knew that it was you behind me."
Oh, that is so sweet.
Oh.
That's amazing.
That is. Wow.
That shows, how you have built up a friendship rather than anything else, which is a lovely thing.
Yeah.
And just before we leave that part of things, there are two Franks I'd very quickly like to touch on. We're talking about Frankenstein, but the two other Franks. Out of all the people, but the fact is, obviously, as a music fan, I'm fascinated about Frank Sinatra, and I think In the Wee Small Hours is one of the greatest albums ever released, and the first long form classic. But what amazed me, and you have met everybody. But as we said, that should be the name of the movie or the book or whatever it's going to be. But how on earth did you get to meet Frank Capra? Because that fascinates. Because we were talking about movies we were going to talk about initially. And we said, let's do Lost Horizon. We'll do that a different time. Because, this was about you and the fact that it's Ronda weekend and what have you. But how did the Frank Capra come around? And then we'll touch on Frank Sinatra.
Well, one of my best friends is Pat Valentine. And Pat was running the Walnut Street Theater Film Society. And Pat was a good friend of David Mallory, who became a good friend of mine. David was a writer and a film historian. and hosted a television show that was aired locally on Channel 3 called The Movie Buff. And every Sunday afternoon, he would run generally Paramount classics and talk about the film. And Frank was on the board of directors of the American Film Institute, along with Frank Capra. So David invited Frank to Philadelphia, and Frank was appearing at the Walnut Street Theater for a screening of one of his films. I can't remember which one, but there was a reception afterward, and I went up to Frank and I got to meet him and chat with him and tell him how much I adored his films, in particular Lost Horizon, which remains my favorite Capra film, and of course the music by Dmitri Tiomkin, which is absolutely ethereal and exquisite. Couple of years after that, Frank was going to be at David Mallory's house. He was staying there for a couple of weeks. And so David asked me, would you like to come and spend the afternoon with Frank? And I said, are you kidding me? Of course. David lived in an upscale neighborhood of Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia called Chestnut Hill, and Capra was staying with David at his house. So I came over, and David said, would you guys like to see It Happened One Night? I have a 16 millimeter print.
Wow.
So David has errands to run, and he left the two of us together. And you have, and I'm losing my voice, but you have to picture, here am I for 2 hours sitting on a bench, David Mallory's rec room in his basement, just Frank Capra and I sitting together, close, watching a 16 millimeter print of It Happened One Night for 2 hours. And it was just one of the greatest experiences of my entire life.
Wow.
And I told Frank I loved him. And I have some letters from Frank, the most moving of which, he had lost his wife, Lou, and he was very depressed. And I wrote him around Christmas time one year and just told him how much he meant to the world and how much I adored him. And he wrote me back just the most beautiful letter saying how much I had brightened his spirits at Christmas time. And here's the director of It Happened One Life, one of the most uplifting, beloved, and inspirational films ever made, telling me that I had brightened his spirits at Christmas time.
Steve, it is you were living the real life version of It's a Wonderful Life, basically. Here's the guy who directed, as you said, the most uplifting Christmas movie, and he's saying those words to you because obviously the wonderful words, no man is ever looser who has a friend, you know, and that's exactly what you'd become. And isn't that an incredible, when you look back on things like it, you've got to do a Veronica Carson and nip yourself sometimes just thinking, wow, that actually happened. That really did happen. I mean, that's incredible, you know, but to have that moment, I mean, at what more apt time could you get a letter like that from the guy who'd made such a classic movie in my top 5 favorite films of all time?
Well, as I said, I'm basically very shy and introverted, unless when I have to be on. And I've been in front of the camera and on stage, so I know how to be on when the moment calls for it. But in my private life, I am very shy. I don't take myself very seriously. As I said at the beginning of our conversation, I just see myself as a fan. I love film and the people who made film. But when I look back on my life, and certainly in moments of insecurity and depression, which of late I've felt a lot because of my health over the last year, and looking at my own immortality or lack of. And I've thought, what have you done with your life? Nothing. You know, and I can remember when I was a kid, when I lived at my mom and dad's house, and in my bedroom, I would tear out pictures from movie magazines of stars that I admired and hang them on my wall. My parents never quite got that, and my dad said paper dollies. And I remember that still, meaning that, you know, that this is just fantasy land. And I can remember I was invited by Gene London, who was a very prominent Philadelphia children's TV host, for many years. And Gene invited me to the Philadelphia Art Museum, which is one of the most prestigious cultural institutions in the country. And Gene was doing a series called Hollywood Screen Fantasies every Sundays for about a month with a live audience. And he had Margaret Hamilton there talking about making The Wizard of Oz. The particular Sunday that I was there as a guest, he had Bill Baird, who was the puppeteer in The Sound of Music, and talked about the song that he did with Julie Andrews and the Marionettes. And I followed Bill Baird, and I was there for an hour talking about the making of King Kong, which is my favorite film, and I've become, I guess, something of an authority. So Gene asked me to come and be a guest and talk in front of a live audience for an hour about the making of the film. So I brought my parents, picked them up, drove them to the Philadelphia Academy of Art Museum, and we did our shtick, applause, and I drove my parents home, and I remember asking them, well, what did you think? And there was dead silence in the back of the car. I said, hello, what did you think? And my mother said, bless her heart, what did we think of what? I said, you're kidding me. The last hour that you sat in my appearance with Gene at the Art Museum. And they both said, well, it's just more paper dollies. And I love my mom and dad, I always will, but it was a total negation of everything that I've been and lived for and aspired to. And I almost lost control of the car in a rage. And I never brought it up again, but in moments of doubt and insecurity, sometimes I'll look around my apartment and look at all the pictures and remember the experiences of people I've known and interacted with and been with. And at other moments, I'll just think, Steve, it's just paper dollies.
No.
It's strange because obviously I was, as you know, I was very unwell. And what happened was I sort of did the same kind of thing when I went into hospital thinking, I wonder if I'll ever see all my posters and my records and everything again. And it was a horrendous time. And all I could think of, I thought, I wonder if I go through all this, if I'll sort of mature or become older or not have this sense of wonder that Ray talked about. You know, will I have gone through so much that I won't have that anymore? And I can tell you now, and I probably don't need to tell you this, in the fact that I got it even greater when I was recovered, the joy of seeing these things again. And I'll never forget that my youngest, who was 10 at the time, brought in, and I woke up and there was Stretch Armstrong at the bottom of my bed, and she goes, I know that's your favorite toy, so I brought in there Stretch Monster there behind me, look. And she goes, I brought that in to cheer you up, because when you opened your eyes to see that, because you're our daddy, but you're still a little boy. Never forget that.
Well, I think I told you this not too many months ago, last October, Johnny Mathis was appearing. He's 86 years old, still performing.
Wow.
The Golden Nugget Hotel in Atlantic City. I'd seen him the year before and would love to have met him, because the very first record album that I ever bought in 1960 was Johnny's Greatest Hits, Wild and Chances Are, and all of those great songs. And I know Chuck Granata, who was the producer and co-host with Nancy Sinatra of Nancy for Frank for years on Sirius Radio. And Nancy and Tina Sinatra adored Johnny Mathis. Their favorite singer was not their dad, but was Johnny Mathis. And Johnny appeared on the show. And I've always heard that Johnny Mathis was a very shy man, liked meeting people, not because he wasn't warm and friendly. He was, but he was afraid. He was just very shy. And now that he's getting older, into his mid-80s and beyond, they're very protective of him. And I asked Chuck, is there any chance that Shelley, my girlfriend, and I could go backstage after the show and meet Johnny Mathis? And his people said, basically nobody goes backstage. We just don't allow it. But okay, Chuck, because it's you, we'll do it. So like one day before the concert, Chuck said, you're in. So we're watching Johnny Mathis perform at the the Golden Nugget in Atlantic City, and he's marvelous. He still hits the high notes. His voice is still very sweet and endearing.
Wow.
And we went afterwards, we climbed these steps and went to a waiting area upstairs backstage. And they said, give it a few minutes, Johnny is changing. So Shelley and I are chatting, and all of a sudden this man walks in with an inverted baseball cap on his head, wearing a sweater, and it's Johnny Mathis with a big smile on his face, and he walks right up to me. He's in my face, literally. He said, Mr. Mathis, I've loved you since I was 14 years old. In 1960, the first LP I ever bought, and is still sitting on my shelf, is Johnny's Greatest Hits. He put his hands on my cheeks, and he reached forward and he kissed me on the lips.
Oh.
I just thought that is the sweetest.
Wow.
One of the most sweetest, touching, endearing moments of my entire life, that here's this man who basically is very shy, is afraid of crowds, very quiet, and we've just met, and he's taking my head in his hands and kissed me on the lips, and I filled up with tears. I just thought,
He's a legend. I got to shoot Johnny Mathis, not in a Hillary Clinton sense again, but I got to photograph him. And obviously he's not one for publicity. As you said, he's very shy, but he was playing one of the big arenas in London still. I mean, he can still pull the crowds in, this guy. And I obviously spent the reason I've got into take a lot of these people is because they are amazed that I know a lot about them. And the reason I know a lot about them is, rather than collecting toys and everything, old cars, even though I did when I was a child, I used to go around my mum and dad's friends' houses. My dad gave me a little Dan-side record player, and I used to go to my parents' friends and say, have you got any records I can have, any old singles and 45s? And one of the first I remember was Wonderful, Wonderful by Johnny Mathis, which I truly adored, that song. And so I knew of him and why he was important. And I remember you had to write to the agent or the company that were running it, and they said, why would you want to take Johnny Mathis' picture? And I just thought, well, okay, I'm going to be a little different. I'm going to let them know that I know enough about this person to try and get in there. And I said, anyone who give the chances up to represent their country, America, in the high jump in the Olympics must be good, if he wants to take a musical career. And I thought, well, I'll just leave it at that. 2 days later, yeah, you're in to see Johnny Mathis. And I was the only photographer allowed in.
Wow.
And if you just let them know that you know a little bit about these people and just how important they are, because he is incredibly important, in the grand scheme of things. And we touched on it with Nancy and everything. Obviously, one of your heroes was Mr. Sinatra. I mean, you've got those wonderful photos that you sent me, which are just great. And he actually wrote to you. You've got from the big man himself.
Well, wow. When I was a kid, I've always loved music, as you may have gathered. And I do sing. I've been singing all my life, and even though I'm Jewish, I've done lots of solos at the church prior to COVID. So I've always loved music and always loved singers. When I was a kid, my hero was Bing Crosby. I just loved his voice. He used to sing along with Bing. When I became a teenager, I was never really into hard rock, but I adored Jimmy Rogers. I played Honeycomb to death until the grooves on the 45 were done. I love Kisses Sweeter Than Wine.
One of the greatest songs of all time. My kids know it, and they know every word of it because I've got it on my jukebox downstairs.
I'm Falling in Love Again. I love Jimmy Rogers. But somewhere around 1960, when I was 14 years old, something in my brain said, you're on the verge of maturity. You're about to become an adult. And maybe it's time to start listening to more mature music. So I still remember this. I don't know why that happened, but it did. And I suddenly heard a deep voice in my head singing All the Way. And the voice was Frank Sinatra. So I went out and bought an LP called This Is Sinatra, Volume 1, which had Three Coins in the Fountain and Rain, and a lot of his big hits from the 50s. And I played it to death. And he became my idol. And in show business, probably the most important human being that I've ever known or experienced in my own 76 years.
Wow.
He is still my idol.
Wow.
My idol after now 62 years. I started writing to him. I did some research and found out that he had his own production company. Sinatra Enterprises was one name. It had several names. When he produced The Manchurian Candidate, I recall, I think it was Essex Productions. So I did some research and found out an address for the company that he formed, and I started writing him letters. And to my shock, he started writing back. And I'd have these lovely letters with this in red FS printed on the letter. And I can remember in the mid 70s, I had gotten mononucleosis. 1 year after that, and I still don't know how to this day, I got hepatitis. And I can remember this is around 1974. Sinatra had just come back from retirement. He retired for a year, decided that wasn't for him. He needed the adulation of performing in the audiences. So he came back, and I had bought tickets for his concert at the Spectrum here in South Philadelphia. So I got hepatitis, and my primary care doctor, Dr. Gerber, said, here's your instructions. You're to go to bed, you're to stay in bed, you're not to get out of bed unless it's to go to the bathroom, and then you're going to go back to bed. And I said, as only I can in my own obnoxious way, yes, but I have tickets to see Frank Sinatra next Tuesday. He said, no, you didn't hear me. I said, you're going to go to bed. You're going to stay in bed, out of bed, unless it's to go to the bathroom. And then you're going back to bed. I said, no, you didn't hear me. I have tickets to see Frank Sinatra next Tuesday night, and I'm going. He said, do you want to live? I said, yes, and I'm going to see Frank Sinatra. I'm with my best friend, Pat Valentine. And he basically said, I'll keep it clean. He said, basically, F you, I won't take you. And I said back, well, F you too, I'll take the bus.
Wow.
So he wound up taking me. I was sitting there in a cold sweat. When the concert ended, I couldn't even stand up. He had to lift me by my shoulders. My eyes had turned deep yellow with jaundice. And he looked into my eyes, and Pat said to me, this is a classic moment. I said, what do you mean? He said, old blue eyes meets old yellow eyes. Of course, the wheels started turning. And I went home back to my sick bed, got out the old typewriter, and wrote a letter to Frank Sinatra about what had occurred. And he wrote me this lovely letter, which I still have, saying how he was delighted that I went to the concert, but was distressed that I was ill, and he hoped that I would get well soon. And it had the FS in red. No, I think at this point it might have been gold FS, but it came from his office, and it was Dear Yellow Eyes, and he signed it Old Blue Eyes.
That's just awesome.
Oh, wow.
That is fantastic.
To get to the virtual end of the story, in 1976, he was appearing at the Latin Casino in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And the sign, the marquee, now this is commonplace now. Lots of venues say he's here, but it had never been used before. And in 1976, on the marquee of the old Latin Casino in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, in big letters, he's here. No one needed to ask, who is he? It was obvious. So the Philadelphia Inquirer had a contest for 3 days, 10 questions a day, a total of 30 questions about Sinatra's life and career. The winner of the contest would get tickets and dinner for 4 to see Frank Sinatra perform at the Latin Casino. Well, guess who won the first prize?
Yay!
He. So I called the Inquirer and I said, I want to meet Frank. And they said, well, that's not part of the prize. I said, I understand that, and I want to meet Frank. And I gave them a lot of BS about, you can drum this up, great publicity for the newspaper, contest winner meets his idol. So they thought, all right, let's talk about it. We'll get back to you. So they called me a day or two later and said, okay, you're in. You're going backstage before the concert. We'll send a photographer to shoot the picture. So I was excited. A friend of mine drove me to the stage door. I walked into the backstage area. Now, I remember it was a long corridor, the door to the parking lot, and it was very narrow. And at the end, there was steps leading somewhere. So I was as nervous, I think, as I've ever been in my entire life, sweat pouring out of me. I didn't bring my camera because I thought, well, the Inquirer photographer to shoot a professional photograph. Well, the guy never showed up. He thought it was a fluff assignment. I heard later he went out to a bar. So here I am meeting my idol for the one and only time in my life, and I don't have a camera with me. So I'm more and more nervous. I'm pacing back and forth, getting ever closer to the opposite wall and to those little wooden steps. I get to the other end of the corridor. There's the wooden steps, and I turn and I look up to the steps, and there's a dressing room. And in the dressing room, larger than life, is Frank Sinatra about to don his tuxedo jacket and adjusting his tie in the mirror. I was frozen in terror. I could not move. I was just transfixed, staring at Frank Sinatra. And something in my brain said, a-hole, you better move, or they're going to throw you out of it. So I forced myself to move. They ushered us upstairs. There were maybe a half dozen people there. And there was one gentleman there who spoke broken English. I think he may have been Argentinian. And he had a very fancy camera around his neck, a 35 millimeter camera with only black and white film. And I begged him, would you please take a picture of Mr. Sinatra and I? And he said, I'll never forget what he said. These words haunt me still. He said, I don't know how to take picture. And I said as lovingly as I could, will you just point it and press the button and shoot it? So they said, Frank, this is the man who won the contest. So Frank Sinatra shook my hand. He said, congratulations. He put his arm around me, which is one of the greatest moments of my entire life. And this gentleman shot 2 pictures. And the moment was gone in what seemed a 16th of a second. And I was ushered down the steps again. And I turned around and I said, I love you, Frank. It was really to say. I felt the moment would never occur again, and I just had to tell him. Anyway, a couple of weeks went by. I gave this gentleman my address, and he wrote me a letter, and he was true to his word. He said, I don't know how to take picture. He said, but neither picture turned out. I was crushed. I had no record whatsoever of my meeting my idol. A couple of months later, I get another letter from this guy, and in the letter is a negative and one small photograph of me and Frank Sinatra. And it's all of me and about 9/10 of Frank. He cut him off at the eye. So I was disappointed but thrilled. I did have something of a record of me and Sinatra. So I remember I was working in television, and across the street in this little mall, there was a Ritz camera. And I took the negative to Ritz camera, and I asked for an 8x10. About a week later, I walked into the camera store, said, my name is Steve Vertlieb. I'm picking up an 8x10. They gave it to me and said, you want to take a look at it before you leave to make sure that it's okay? So I said, sure. So I opened it, and took out this 8x10, and I see all of me, and there's nobody else in the picture. I said, there was somebody else in the picture. And the guy behind the counter said, yeah, but it was imperfect. We thought we would fix it for you.
Oh, my word.
I remember saying, I think you missed the point. So we did it, and you've seen the picture, and that's all I got.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing. It's amazing.
I have letters from Frank, autographed pictures from Frank, even an autographed record, The Look of Love, which he signed to Steve from Frank Sinatra. I've got the letters and the autographed pictures spread all over my apartment.
That's truly amazing. I mean, what is great, I interviewed a guy called John Layton for Cinema Retro, which is coming out next month, Steve, and he was in The Great Escape and what have you, but he also ended up in Von Ryan's Express. And he wasn't a huge star, especially in America. But he said Frank Sinatra, he was devastated. Once he heard that Frank Sinatra was going to be in this movie, and he'd had a #1 hit over here with a big song called Johnny Remember Me. And, he was really, really keen to work with Sinatra. And he said Sinatra at first was a bit, cool with them, then got to know him. But then he said they were filming next to the movie, I think it was Peyton Place or something. But anyway, Mia Farrow was on that set. And this guy, John Layton, had known Mia Farrow. So he introduced Frank Sinatra to Mia Farrow, which is quite amazing, and obviously that didn't turn out as joyous as Frank would have hoped. But at the same time, before it all went pear-shaped, he was in Las Vegas, and Frank said, I'm going to be playing in Las Vegas. Why don't you come down and see me? And he had this very attractive girlfriend at the time, now his wife. And he thought, well, you're not going to turn down the chance of taking your girlfriend to see Frank Sinatra. And of course, he was this not struggling actor, but he wasn't a huge name. And he went to the casino where Frank was playing. And the guy said, oh, yes, Mr. Layton. And he took him down, and he said he walked through an endless line of people. And it kept going and going and going. And it took him right down to the front of the stage where there was this special table which was put down just for the two of them, right in front of Frank Sinatra, where Frank Sinatra would be singing. And Frank Sinatra came on, looked down, and pointed at John like this. And of course, this was going to impress the now wife immensely, saying, wow, that's incredible. And then he started getting all these drinks through, and he started really genuinely worrying about how he was going to afford to get all this food, the lobster and the champagne and everything that was coming to his table. And he was thinking, how am I going to pay this? And in the end, he went up rather nervously to the person and said, yes, could I have my check, please? And he said, no, that was Mr. Sinatra paid for everything.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
I think you probably heard this before, but in 1993, when I was still married to my ex-wife, she said to me at one point, you've written all these articles, all this poetry. You've never written a word about your idol, Frank Sinatra. Why don't you write a poem about him? And I said, I've never really thought about it. How can I do that? So I thought about it a bit more, and I wrote a poem, and I called it Sinatra. And I wrote to his then publicist. Lee Solder had been his publicist. He died and handed the business over to his daughter. So I contacted her, and I sent her the poem. And I said, and I remember saying this, because again, I am very introverted and shy, and I don't want to be pushy. And I said, look, I don't want anything from him. I know he's Frank Sinatra. I know he's loved by millions of people. I'm not asking for anything. I just wrote this out of love. And if it's at all possible, would you just show it to him? I got back the nastiest, cruelest letter I've ever gotten in my life. She just berated me and said, who the hell do you think you are? Sculptors, painters have paid tribute to Sinatra. And who the hell do you think you are? I was so angry. I remember shaking with rage. And I tore the letter up into a million pieces and threw it away. Now, I had developed a relationship of sorts with Barbara Sinatra. She, for whatever reason, loved my poetry. And I had her address, her P.O. box. I don't remember how I got it, but I got it, and we had corresponded. And she always wrote me about how much she loved my poetry. So I sent her the letter that I'd written about her husband. Well, a few weeks later, I remember on a Saturday morning, my then wife wanted me to take her shopping. So we were living at our house, and I opened the door, and wedged between the two doors was a package. And I thought, what's this? And I held the package in my hand, and the return address was Sinatra Enterprises. And I froze. I thought, oh my God. Well, I opened it up, and there was this magnificent color photograph of Frank Sinatra in concert on stage at Madison Square Garden. And on it, in gold ink, was inscribed, and I'm paraphrasing, "Dear Steve, thank you so much for your lovely poetry and your loyalty and friendship to me for all these years. Love, Frank Sinatra." And I went, oh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Wow. And so that's framed in a gold frame.
Well, it's a golden memory, isn't it? A full stop. I mean, that's quite incredible. It really is unbelievable. But you see, this is a thing, people like ourselves, we love music and movies in equal measure, and sometimes they are one and the same. With Ennio Morricone wouldn't, those westerns would not be the westerns they are without his music. The Bond movies wouldn't be the Bond movies without John Barry, Rose, all these, Bernard Herrmann. They are characters in themselves and just as important as the actors. So that's why I wanted to touch on the music side of stuff, Steve. But the other thing, before we go on, I know we've been on for some time now, and I apologize, but this is the way things are. But to be honest, we've got a lot to cover here. But the one thing I wanted to, and I think it's very important, I saw my author friend yesterday, and he's a huge poster collector. And he's called Neil Pettigrew, and he wrote several really famous books on stop motion and, about George Powell, about Ray Harryhausen, and what have you. And he said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" I said, "Well, we're interviewing Steve Vertlieb." And he went, "What, as in the girl in the hairy paw, Steve Vertlieb?" I went, "Yeah, it's amazing how many people will immediately go, girl in the hairy paw." And I said to him, "Yeah, it seems to be very well known, doesn't it?" And he said, it's the absolute definitive book. And he said, "I believe it was the first." And you covered that earlier on. How did that come up? I know it's your favorite film, and as it was Ray's, but what was that like to write? Because, and it's now revered.
Well, again, as in most stories, it has its roots elsewhere. When I was a kid, before I had ever seen King Kong, my mother used to tell me stories about seeing this movie when she was a young woman, about a gigantic ape being taken out of a jungle and transported to New York and carrying this blonde woman to the top of the Empire State Building. And I was wont to do with a massive imagination, started imagining this before I'd ever seen the film and thinking about it, even having nightmares of this gigantic monster, this gigantic gorilla, walking by my bedroom window and looking in and reaching in to grab me. But I'd never seen the film. But based on her stories of being a young woman, I created this whole myth in my brain about King Kong. Well, comes the time that King Kong is going to premiere on Philadelphia television. It was something like 4:30 or 5 o'clock on a weekday afternoon. I've been thinking about it for weeks. I could not wait to see it. And of course, as these things will happen, I was a kid and I said or did something that made my mother angry. And as punishment, you're not going to watch television. I thought, are you out of your mind? Do you know how long I've waited to see Kong? And she said, well, you were bad, so sorry. So I ran out of the house, and I ran down the street to my then girlfriend house. I must have been 9 or 10 years old, Lois, Loie. And I begged her mother to let me come in and watch King Kong. So she turned on the television, the film started, and I'm into about a half an hour of King Kong, where she tells me, well, Steve, it's our dinner time, so you're going to have to leave. What? So I'd made it this far. I was watching Kong for the first time, and now she's going to have dinner and is kicking me out. So I ran a block and a half to another friend's house, on the next block and begged them to let me turn on the TV and watch the remainder of King Kong. And it was disjointed, but I fell in love with the film. It was the greatest thing that I'd ever seen in my life. But I longed to see it on the big screen in its entirety. Well, as luck would have it, that next Saturday I went to the Banner Theater, as I did every Saturday for most of my childhood, for the Saturday matinee. And prior to the feature film, of course, they would have a serial, a cartoon, and trailers. And they ran the trailer to next week. And I'm looking at the big screen at the Banner, and all of a sudden I'm seeing black and white, and I'm seeing the gates of some sort of a shrine, and the gates are opening, and there is King Kong reaching out and grabbing the natives. And next week at this theater, King Kong, and I went, oh. So needless to say, I was at the theater the next Saturday, saw King Kong on the big screen for the first time in its entirety. Since then, I know Ray said that he had seen Kong over 200 times.
Yeah.
At this point in my life, I've probably seen Kong 300 times. Every time it's on, I'm entranced again. People have said, don't you ever get tired of it? No. Are you kidding me?
It's interesting, Steve, because obviously I was saying it was shown on Thursday. My 11-year-old, I was sitting in bed to watch it because it was on quite late, and my 11-year-old said, "Oh, I can't sleep because I can hear King Kong." So she came in and she sat in the bed watching it with me, and I said, "Look at that! Isn't it amazing how the hairs move on his back?" Thinking that would, get. And she goes, "No, they're not. That's not the wind, Dad. You told me when I was 6 that were the fingers of the technicians," and she remembered it, and that really made me so happy that she did that. And she said, "It's such an amazing fantasy," and that blew my mind. I thought the fact she remembered that really made me very happy.
Well, I mean, I knew Marion Cooper quite well through intense correspondence for the last 8 years of his life. I spent 2 afternoons with Fay Ray at her apartment in Century City. I even met Bruce Cabot once for about a 16th of a second when he was touring with John Wayne and Red Buttons. That's another story. Promoting Atari, I stood next to Duke Wayne for about a second and just clutched my heart, didn't have the courage to say a word.
How did that come about? Was it a promotion or something? How did
Atari had opened and they were touring the country, and Atari opened in 1963 at the Stanton Theater in downtown Philadelphia. And I heard that I was listening to the Red Benson show on WPEN radio the night before, and his guests were John Wayne, Bruce Cabot, and Red Buttons, all talking about Atari and stating that they were going to appear live on stage to introduce the film the next morning at the theater. So, of course, Erwin and I said we have to be there. But again, the wheels turning, always thinking. I said to Erwin, look, we can go see the movie. We'll be sitting at the back of the theater. They'll be in the distance. Here's another idea. It's just a chance, but take it. That's a line from A Star is Born. James Mason,
yeah.
I said, we can see the movie anytime, but what I'd like to do is go to the back of the theater and stand there and see what happens. So we went to the back of the theater. There were a line of zebra-painted Jeeps, and the door opens, out comes Red Buttons. I had my little autograph book as a kid, asked him to sign it. Bruce Cabot walked out, couldn't have cared less, was indifferent to anyone, which is maybe why Fay Ray didn't want to talk about him when I mentioned his name, but didn't have the time or the strength of will to write his full name, just wrote B. Cabot. And then out came John Wayne, who was a gigantic man. And I clutched my chest, couldn't breathe, couldn't say a word. I just stared at him. Sometime after that, again, doing some research, I found out that his company was Batjack Productions. Batjack was the name of the shipping firm in the wake of the Red Witch from 1948. He called his company that. So I wrote him at Bat Jack Productions, wrote him this 5-page letter. And he wrote me back, and I still have, he sent me an autographed picture from True Grit, signed it Rooster, and then sent me a lovely letter from Durango, Mexico, where he was shooting a picture. And he said, well, kid, you brought back a memory or two. And
very good.
Yes.
Very good.
And I still have that. And I forgot again where this was going.
No, you were saying when you met him, I said, how did you meet him? And you said, because of this movie that was shown, and we just got on to John Wayne, because you don't you don't know many people have met John Wayne, to be honest. So we couldn't let that slip.
No.
But it was we were talking about Girl with the Hairy Paw. Yeah.
We're talking, that's how that started. That's where that was going. So I developed this fanaticism about King Kong. I have an original fin from the back of the Stegosaurus model that was given to me many years ago.
Was that from Florrie Ackerman? Did he give you that?
Florrie did not give it to me. Florrie gave it to a friend of mine named Wes Shank.
Right.
And Wes gave it to me.
That's incredible.
Wow.
My word. Because Nick and I have been incredibly lucky, because we actually got to hold it, didn't we? We actually got to hold Kong.
The original armature.
The original armature, which was you couldn't believe. And she was so lovely to us, wasn't she? Bless her heart.
Oh God, yeah.
Gone now, And Kathy was so lovely, and she goes, yes, you can hold it. And so we were like, oh my word. It was just, and we were holding the guns from Blade Runner and all sorts. We were just two kids, but we couldn't believe that we were doing that. But to actually have in your collection something from one of the actual armatures is mind blowing. Quite frankly.
I have it in plexiglass.
And has it still got the rubber on it? Has it still got any?
A little bit, not much.
Yeah, but incredible that you've got that. Steve. I mean, that's mind blowing.
Wow. Yeah, I can search my files and send you a picture of it.
Oh, please. I'd love just to see it. I'd love to see it.
But anyway, to answer your question, comes 1972, and I had a telephone call from a gentleman named Chuck McNaughton, who told me that he was the editor of a first-time ever bi-weekly monster tabloid called the Monster Times.
Yeah.
It was going to be published in New York City and come out on newsstands every other week. And would I be willing to be among the first writers for it? So I was honored. I was going to get paid for it. It was my first paying gig as a writer. And I said, of course. And he said, what would you like to write about? I didn't have to think about that terribly long. I said, the making and production of King Kong. He said, wonderful. So I wrote it, and it appeared in 2 parts. And the first and the third issues, I was not happy with the way it was presented. The first issue was pretty much as I wrote it. The third issue, he changed it and kind of dumbed it down and said, well, kids don't want to read all this this technical jargon, so he dumbed it down, and I was not thrilled. But after it was published, I had a phone call from a gentleman named Ron Gottesman, who was a professor at Rutgers University. And he said that he and his partner, Harry Gettold, who was a professor at Indiana University, were prepping a book, the first book ever written about King Kong, called Girl in the Hairy Paw. They had read my article in the Monster Times, and they wanted to come to Philadelphia, take me out for lunch, and talk about having my article lead the book. So I said, wow. So we got together, had lunch. We all became fast friends. I knew them both for years until they passed. And Ron said, would you like to redo it, rewrite it to make it more, more formal, as would be fit of a book rather than a monster tabloid. So I did rewrite it. Basically kept the facts and the tone and the tenor, but buffed it up a bit. So it became the lead chapter in The Girl in the Hairy Paw. I still have the promotional posters for the book cover.
Wow.
So I used to have one of them hanging in my editing booth at Channel 29. But I have a few of those left. But I wrote the lead chapter for The Girl in the Hairy Paw, and it just further cemented my love and devotion to the big ape.
Which is amazing.
Wow.
And obviously the Monster Times is such a revered, periodical now. I've got the Star Trek one, obviously, which a lot of people have, and, which you particularly like, because obviously Bill Shatner was
Yeah.
good. It was great.
That's another story, and I don't want to bore you.
You're not boring us.
No.
You're not boring us, Steve.
You're three
I heard that Bill
boyhood
Shatner.
captains.
Well, I loved Star Trek. I remain a huge Star Trek fan, and I loved Jim Kirk. And I heard that in the summer of 1969, I heard that William Shatner was coming to do a play at the Playhouse in the Park, which is long gone. There's a Girl in My Soup, which co-starred Jill Hayworth, who was in Exodus. And so I telephoned the people who ran the Playhouse in the Park in the summer of 1969 and said, look, I'm a writer. I'm published. I write about sci-fi fantasy films. I'd love to interview William Shatner. So they said, great, we'll set it up. Come on out and we'll do it. Again, I was totally square. It was like 100 degrees. And I was wearing a jacket and tie and sweating my brains out. But I got to spend a solid hour with Bill Shatner in his dressing room. And we talked all about Kong. I was there with my brother Erwin and one of my best friends, Alan Asherman, who became well known as an authority on Star Trek. He did the Star Trek Compendium. That's another story, which I'll get into very briefly. But I did the interview with Shatner. I wrote the questions, did 90% of the interview. Erwin and Alan might have asked one question each, but essentially I did the interview. I knew that William Shatner hated Star Trek at that point, wanted to put a lot of distance between him and the series. I even asked him at one point, I said, there are rumors that there will be a Star Trek movie. He cut me off and said, no, nothing, forget it. I never did that. Obviously that changed, and he obviously changed his mind. But I had the guts. I brought a bunch of stills with me, and I asked him if he would sign a couple of them, Captain Kirk. And I was waiting for him to strangle me. The guts to ask that. But he did. He was a gentleman, and he signed a Captain Kirk. And he asked, would you boys like to come and see the show? So I said, yes. So we came and watched the show. And when the show was over, as he was leaving the stage, he turned back and looked at us and waved, which is very lovely.
Oh.
So fast forward a couple of years, the Monster Times and the Star Trek issue of the Monster Times. And Alan Asherman called me and said, they're doing a Star Trek issue and they'd like to do your interview from L'Incroyable Cinema. Would you have any problem with that? And he said, no, of course not. But I didn't know, and what upset me to this day is in the original magazine in Manchester, England, in L'Incroyable Cinema, the credit for the interview read, by Steve Vertlieb with Alan Asherman and Erwin Vertlieb. I thought I'll be a nice guy and include them in the byline. When it was published by the Monster Times, it read by Alan Asherman with the Vertlieb brothers.
Oh.
I was not happy, not at all.
No.
And I felt betrayed by the newspaper and by my good friend Alan Asherman. And I've never told him that to this day it hurts me, and it does, because I thought I did it, and I was enough of a gentleman to include their names in the byline, and I was almost an afterthought in the credit in the Monster Times Star Trek issue. And I called him, and I said, "Why did you do that?" And he said to me, "Oh, it's nothing personal. It's just that I was a bigger name," meaning Alan. "Nobody really knows you. Nobody ever heard of Steve Vertlieb, but Alan Asherman in Star Trek circles is well known. And that's why we did it, because they have to think of the commercial aspect of hawking the newspaper. And then when his book, the Star Trek Compendium came out, there was the interview again and again. And this book has been around forever, and all the Star Trek nuts know it. And there again, it said, by Alan Asherman with the Vertlieb brothers.
Oh.
Wow. Started that as something of a personal betrayal. And Alan and I are still friends. He called me on the phone a couple of weeks ago when he heard about my open heart surgery tomorrow morning, and he was very sweet and very lovely and wished me all the best and said I'm in his thoughts and prayers. And we said we love each other, which we still do. We've been friends since 1965, but I can't... I'm not going to call myself a creative artist. That sounds a little pretentious, but I've been doing this for over a half a century, and it's my legacy, and that, to this day, that still bothers me.
The one line that gets me is that no one knows who you are.
Yeah. Ask
Ray Harryhausen or Peter Cushing that. I think they'll correct him. But this is the thing, sometimes I've to a much lesser degree, I've had interviews changed where they've dumbed it down or taken out the best parts, and it's broken my heart. And we're talking about, high-level magazines here. I'm not going to name them, but I've been devastated that they've filled it with stuff which was inconsequential, yet taken out part of the key part, which was the technical side, which is just as important. And is exactly what you said. And I opened a magazine 2 weeks ago, and it was an article in Ray Harryhausen, and they'd stolen a heading from my tribute to Ray Harryhausen, Lock, Stock and Barrel, Poetry in Stop Motion. And I just thought, how dare they? I was really angry about it. And I spoke to Neil about it. I said, I'm really quite angry about that. He said, those people probably thought they did that themselves because they've read your article. It's been in the back of their mind. They probably quoted it. I said, yeah, but really, and you try to get on it. And it's hard sometimes not to get angry about stuff. But, as we know, there's bigger and better things, I suppose, to be upset about. But, it's sometimes, especially when it's something you've done, you kind of get annoyed about it. But on more important things, and I just want to touch on this because the one thing you talked about having a piece of, from Kong and what have you. Did you ever go to the Acker Mansion? Because that's something, we talked about Bob's Basement, but that's something Nick and I'm sure Mary and Vince would have loved to have done.
Oh, yeah.
Well, not only did I go to the Acker Mansion, and that was that one day in Hollywood in 1974 when Robert Bloch acted as our chauffeur for an entire day and night. And not only did he take us to see George Pell at Paramount, but he also took us to Fari's Acker Mansion. And we spent time there, and I have wonderful photographs of Robert Bloch and Fari along with Irwin and I. And it was an astonishing collection, obviously, and I adored Fari. But one thing I did not mention, and speaking of King Kong, which you might find of interest, is that although I never got to meet Coop, but we were very close through correspondence. I mean, there were weeks when I would get almost a letter or a package every day of the week for years. I think he was so impressed that this kid knew who he was, and we developed this intimate relationship over his career and over King Kong in particular, and The Girl in the Hairy Paw and the whole 9 yards. But after he passed away in 1980, I wrote to Dorothy Cooper, who, if you've ever seen The Searchers, she was an actress, Dorothy Jordan. She's the woman who was massacred. Her family was massacred by the Indians at the beginning of The Searchers. And I thought she looked remarkably like Fay Ray. But Dorothy, I told her I was going to be in LA, and I'd love to come and visit. They lived in Coronado, in the house that Coop had lived in, and she invited me to come for an afternoon and see them. So we did. Irwin drove. We stayed over. I remember we went to Tijuana for about a minute. It was so close to where we were staying, and we drove into Mexico, and it was so utterly dirty. We left immediately. We were going to eat there, but we decided not to. But In any case, we went to their home in Coronado. I spent an afternoon with Dorothy. She showed me the original hand-bound script with Cooper's notes in it, handwritten notes. I held it in my hand. I stood next to the original caricature, which the cast and crew had given Coop for Christmas in 1932, which showed him holding a bullhorn, yelling, "Make it bigger, make it bigger." I think Faray had printed that in Famous Monsters. And I stood right next to that on the wall.
Wow.
I met Coop's son, Richard, who just died not terribly long ago. But I remember at the end, firstly I told Dorothy that I had a 16 millimeter print of King Kong, which I still do. And she said to me, if anyone should have that, you should. But at the end of the conversation, we were there several hours, and I got a little misty-eyed, because here I was in the home of the man who created King Kong. And we'd had this relationship, and I started tearing up. And I said to Dorothy, you know what? This is so special. I wish that he were here. And she held my hands and she said, he's here. He's here. And it was a lovely way to end that afternoon.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, while we're on, this is something I've always wanted to ask you. I think I know the answer, but if there's one horror stroke fantasy film that should never be remade, what would it be? And what would you and what classic would you like to see remade, or someone become involved, someone like a Spielberg who has some kind of apathy for the skin, some kind of intelligence, who could remake something well? If there's one movie that should never be touched and one movie that is crying out for a remake, which ones would there be?
That's really tough. You know what? I have thought about this. I would like to see someone like Steven Spielberg tackle a remake of Forbidden Planet.
Right.
I love Forbidden Planet to death. I've already told you the story about waiting a year and seeing it or not seeing it at the Benner Theater when my mother yanked us out of the theater. But there are things about it that bother me, particularly the scene where Morbius is confronting his inner self, his id, and it's all off camera, where you hear you see the faces of Anne Francis and Leslie Nielsen watching his torment, but they never show what he's going through. And I think with special effects the way they are, someone like a Spielberg to do a big billion-dollar serious remake of Forbidden Planet would be wonderful, and it wouldn't take anything away from the original.
Well, it wouldn't.
Remains one of the greatest sci-fi films of all time. But
and we all know that Shakespeare never goes out of fashion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's the Tempest, yeah.
Yeah, it is the Tempest.
You got to meet Robbie Robot, didn't you?
I did. With the actual. How do you know that?
I think it's going to be easier, guys, to ask Steve who he hasn't met.
Well,
I had a friend of a friend who knew Bill Malone, the horror film director.
Yeah.
And Bill owned Robbie, the real Robbie, and he had him totally rebuilt. And they said, would you like to go over to Bill Malone's house and meet Robbie? And it was like asking a 6-year-old if you want a chocolate ice cream. It's like, yeah. So we spent a couple of hours at Bill Malone's house, and we chatted, and Bill said, well, I guess I know the real reason you're here, and it's not to meet me. It's to meet him. And so we opened up his closet, and there was Robbie the robot. And
wow.
I said, can I touch him? He said, of course. So I touched him, took a lot of pictures with Robbie, and it was just a thrill. I mean, there are folks out there who have made their own models of Robbie full size, but this is the real Robbie the robot who was in Forbidden Planet and The Invisible Boy. Bill finally decided a couple of years ago that Robbie should be in a museum, not owned just by one guy. And so he sold Robbie, and I think he's now being displayed in the Sci-Fi Museum somewhere in Hollywood. But I got to pose and talk to, and he didn't answer me back. I got to stand next to, touch, and get photographed with Robbie.
That's awesome.
Great.
Now, okay, guys, I'm gonna have to excuse myself.
I've just noticed we've been talking for 3 hours 20 minutes, but it's been such a pleasure, Steve. We could talk all day, but I'm fully aware that this is a podcast. But just before we go, okay, this is the interesting thing. Someone asked me this question the other day. The movie hasn't been released yet. I really think it should be. What would you call it, or what would the tagline for the movie be in your eyes? And I think that someone really needs to get this sorted out.
Which film?
For your movie, for the movie of your life, The Man Who Saved the Movies.
The Man Who Saved the Movies. I hated the title, and it got me into a lot of trouble with the fan base. I have a problem with the fan base. Not that I don't think I'm anything special. I'm just a fan. I love movies. I love the people who made movies. I love the people who love the people who made movies. But a lot of the fans, really not nice people. And they get on the high horses and think, who the hell do you think you are? And when I first mentioned that the film was being shot at the Classic Horror Film Board, the folks who do the Rondo Awards, I got such nasty comments, and I won't mention names, that several prominent fans and writers just attacked me like you wouldn't believe. And who the hell do you think you are? And I said, guys, this is not just about me. It's about all of us. It's about fans. But they didn't get it, and they attacked me. The director, Craig Jameson, said, I'll fix it for you. He stepped in, they attacked him. And I had to say, as did he, over and over and over again, saved in the title is in parentheses, as in acquired, saved the memory of, saved the posters. Not that I saved the movies, for God's sake, but I saved the memories of the movies and the collectibles and the friendships.
Exactly.
But they were just out to get me, and it got very nasty. And David Colton, who was the editor-in-chief of USA Today and created the Classic Horror Film Board.
Yes, he's a genius, and he deserves an Oscar, his own Oscar.
Yes.
Rondo, I should say. He's a wonderful man, David Colton.
And David said no one should have to go through the shit that you did with that, and I apologize. The Man Who Loved Movies, maybe. But Craig thought it was a great title. He wanted to stick with it. But I thought you have to be blind not to see that saved is in parentheses, and there's a reason why it means something.
What would you call it, Steve? What would you like to call it? What would be the tagline for you?
Maybe a life at the movie theater. Just adoration of film. I mean, in my 76 years, films are everything to me. My girlfriend will say, "What are you watching?" And I'll say, "King Kong." And how many times have you seen it? Well, I said, we're heading toward the 400 mark. Wow. And she said, how can you watch it over and over again? And I'll say, because it occupies a special place in my heart. And each time I see it, I see something new that I've never seen before. And each time I see it, it opens up a Disneyland, a fairyland of magic, where I just get lost in my dreams. And it's just a world of beauty and magic and charm and fantasy that has been a dear friend of mine for all of these years. And when I'm in my deepest, darkest depression, I look around at the pictures on my wall, and I look back at the things that I've done and the people I've known, and it just warms my heart and makes me think that maybe my life had some value to it.
Your life has been an amazing journey. It's it's like It's a Wonderful Life. No man is a failure who has friends. All of us are friends, and your fandom, full stop, owes so much to you. And what I'd love you to do, you're all in our thoughts because we know exactly what's happening tomorrow.
Yes.
But when you do get back, Steve, I want you to put Kong on. Take you back to that wonderful childhood window and think of us and the conversation we've had and think, wow, I'm glad that's over and now it's the next stage. Because there are so many more things for you to watch, my friend, and we all want you to be part of our world.
Yes.
Yes. For real.
You. Thank you. That means a great deal, and I hope you'll all keep me in healing thought and prayer over this next
Absolutely.
week.
No,
we
I will.
We will.
And Steve, it has been an absolute honor to have you on. I can't tell you.
Yes.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it, and God bless you all.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. God bless.
I'm very happy to have met you and listened to you. And I'm also happy, well, I'm not happy, but I wish Vince had still been here because I think he might have moved us up to Philadelphia permanently so he could move next to you and set up camp.
I can imagine that. I can just imagine that, Mary.
Because you two would have just gone on for hours.
Yeah.
He would have adored you. He would have been fine. Yeah. You would have had to lock your doors and put out a restraint against him because
no. I love this stuff, and I love talking with people who love the same things that I do.
Yeah.
Steve, I said it's always a pleasure when a hero becomes a friend, and that's what you are.
Oh my
and I
God.
thank you for it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Steve. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank you. God bless you all. Thank you so much.
You'll be in our thoughts and prayers, Steve. You take care, and we will speak in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
You tell us as soon as you're out, and we'll get the bunting out.
Yes.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Great to see you, Steve. Take care. Bye now.
Adios, Mafia.
Well, they've gone.
For good, John?
No, just for now. It wasn't the right time for us to meet. But there'll be other nights, other stars for us to watch. They'll be back.
The ghosts are moving tonight, restless, hungry.
All right, fellas, here's your story. Greetings, my friend. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives. And we cannot keep this a secret any longer.
Wait, Captain. I have found evidence of intelligent beings on this planet.
Look to the skies, it's the B-Movie Cookbook. Menus inspired by 15 of your favorite B-movies from the 1950s, with teenage werewolves, blobs, and enough cheese for everyone.
When we return to our planet, the High Court may well sentence you to torture.
But until then, we've got Ed Wood and Vincent Price.
There'll be food and drink and ghosts, and perhaps even a few murders. You're all invited.
So impress your friends with dinner and a movie with the B-Movie Cookbook. We've got you covered. Get your copy today at bmoviecookbook.com. That's bmoviecookbook.com.
Let me see that book. I am interested to see what sways your mind so heavily.
Sure thing, just visit bmoviecookbook.com.
Anybody around here want some coffee?
Transmission.
The good guys always win, even in the 80s.